Good evening. It's lovely to see so many of you here tonight. My name is Martin Buzzer. I'm a senior lecturer in physics at the University of Hull, and it is my great pleasure to be the chair for tonight's debate. So on behalf of the University of Hull, I would like to welcome you to tonight's sellout debate on Can Life Have Meaning Without God, which forms part of the University of Hull's City of Culture program. So before I introduce our distinguished speakers, let me just say a brief words about how this debate came about. So the debate is organized by an informal group of Christian academics at the university who had a strong desire to promote the university as a forum of open inquiry where the big questions of life and faith can be discussed and debated in a constructive and open manner. So we felt that Hull's City of Culture status this year presented a wonderful opportunity to do this, since belief and increasingly non-belief is such a strong driving force behind much of today's culture. Well, for tonight's debate, I think we've chosen to have a conversation about what is arguably the biggest question of all. So given the caliber of the speakers we have here tonight, I think we're in for a very thought-provoking and culturally enriching evening. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Answering yes to the question, I presume, for tonight's debate is Andrew Copson, CEO of the British Humanist Association. His writing on humanist and secularist issues has appeared in The Guardian, The Independent, The Times, The New Statesman, and he has represented the BHA and humanism extensively on television and radio, for example, for television news on the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Sky, etc., Newsnight, Today, The World at One. So very impressive CV. He is former director of the European Humanist Federation and is currently also president of the International Humanist and Ethical Union. He has represented humanist organizations at Westminster, the EU and the UN. And together with A.C. Grayling, Andrew has edited the Wiley-Blackwell Handbook of Humanism. So answering no to tonight's question is Dr. Andy Bannister, Director of the Solar Center for Public Christianity and an adjunct speaker for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. From universities to churches, business forums to TV and radio, Andy regularly addresses audiences of all faiths and none on issues relating to faith, culture, politics, and society. Andy holds a PhD in Islamic Studies and has taught extensively at the universities across Canada, USA, and the UK on both Islam and philosophy. Andy is the author of 2 books, including one that we'll sell tonight, so you can get it signed and double its value. The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, okay, well, more of that in a moment. A humorous engagement with the new atheism. He also co-wrote and presented the TV documentary Burning Questions. So these are our speakers for tonight. So the structure of tonight's debate is very simple. We will start with an opening statement from each speaker lasting 25 minutes, 25 minutes each. We will then have a response by each speaker lasting 10 minutes each. Finally, we'll have a question and answer session where the audience can direct questions to either both speakers. So that will last for around 40 minutes. So as chair tonight, it is my job to make sure that both speakers keep to their allotted time. Now, both of you can't see this from where you're standing, but there is in fact a big red button under my table here that controls a trap door, okay, under your chairs. So please, okay, please make sure you keep to time, okay? As I mentioned, there will also be opportunity for audience participation in tonight's debate through a Q&A session. So let me just briefly explain how this will work. So to submit a question, please send your question to the mobile number or email address which is on the screen behind me. You might want to take note of the number or the email address because the slide is liable to change, especially during Andy Bannister's address. Okay, so the case of too many Andys today, but so Andy Bannister's address. So do take note of the number. To make it easier for us to select questions, please make sure your questions are clear, courteous, and to the point. If your question is directed to a specific speaker, please also say so clearly in your text. If you haven't got a mobile phone with you or you can't get a signal for whatever reason, you can submit your questions via the traditional way, via pen and paper. All you need to do is to catch the attention of one of our lovely stewards who will supply you with all the writing implements, etc., as well as collect your questions. Okay, so just catch their attention if you want to submit your questions in that way. I will also take a few live questions from the audience towards the latter half of the Q&A session. But once again, please keep your questions clear, courteous, and to the point. After tonight's debate, Waterstones will be running a book table in the foyer where you can find a range of books relevant to tonight's topic at discounted prices. Okay, so in addition to that, two student societies, that is the Hull University Secularist, Atheist, and Humanist Society (HUSA) and Rooted in Christ, are running information tables in the foyer where you can find a range of free resources relevant to tonight's topic. The Arts Cafe, which is just on my right here, will also remain open until 10 o'clock. So if you're not in a hurry, do stay back, visit the book table, the information tables, and just carry on those conversations over a cup of coffee. Okay, great. So finally, there are no planned fire drills tonight. So if you hear a loud siren, it is the fire alarm. Don't panic, I'll be the first to leave, in order to lead you to safety. So please, in that situation, leave this building in an orderly manner through the fire exits, which are through the doors you came in, or there are two fire exits on the side doors as well. Great, so that's all I wanted to say. So let's get this show started, as they say. So our first speaker will be Andrew Copson. Can life have meaning without God? You have 25 minutes. Thank you.
I always like to look for evidence, when someone makes a claim. It's a great pleasure to be here in Hull. Thank you very much for inviting us here this evening. The last time I was here, we were unveiling a plaque to Jacob Bronowski, just in Cottingham, because he was obviously a humanist strongly associated with this university. And it's lovely to be invited to talk about a topic that was close to his heart, as it is to the heart of every humanist, this question of meaning in life. And so I'm very pleased to be invited to give a humanist perspective on this question. So here we find ourselves, human beings, apparently the products of the same physical processes that produce stars and planets, and the same biological processes that produce dandelions and cats and elephants. But unlike other animals on Earth, we've come to consciousness of our surroundings and of ourselves. So what do we know when we open our eyes in this world? Well, we can see from our own observations and the evidence of our senses, I think, that we live in a universe that lacks any discernible purpose, certainly any purpose vis-a-vis ourselves. We don't, as our ancestors did, some of them, believe that we are at the centre of this universe. We know, because we can see it, that we are on one tiny planet, in one tiny solar system, in one tiny galaxy, in an enormous universe. We are undoubtedly the products of this Earth, millennia of evolution on this world. And this can give us, I think, a sense of rootedness. This world molded us. It is our home. And as we hurtle through space without even realizing it, it nourishes and sustains us. What else? Well, we've been born into a vast human family. Its members stretch back in time, as we can tell from the traces that they've left, that we can see, and today spread all around us across the globe. And we also know that no member of this family lives forever. One of the earliest things that any conscious human realizes is that every person, including him or herself, at some point will die. So, this world is our only place. This life is the only life we know we have. And before we were born and came into consciousness, our personalities did not exist. When we die, they will cease to exist. These are the basic facts of existence that every humanist accepts, and they are the reality upon which a humanist approach to life is to be built. That's where we start. I said a moment ago that we are conscious, and this is a very important thing. Unlike other animals, we can think about what is happening to us. We can remember, and we can look forward. And these are the capacities in us that raise the question of meaning. We're not just organisms to which things happen. In our minds, events take on a significance because we give them meaning. And that's what meaning is. Something we attribute to our experiences, something with which we endow our lives. And once the basic needs of shelter, warmth, and nutrition have been met, human beings start to think about meaning. They do. They start to do this human meaning-making thing. And we attribute meaning to our experiences as we move through the days and weeks and months and years, telling the story of our own lives to ourselves inside our own heads. Along the way, we adopt goals that give us a sense of purpose and something to look forward to. We develop connections and relationships with other people, with the natural world that we're a part of, that we engage with, often with great wonder as well as curiosity, with the stories and art that we respond to in ourselves, and we develop a connection and relationship with our own self as well, as we grow and change, all the time generating meaning from these experiences. So, relationships with others, with family, with friends, with lovers, the satisfying long-term relationships, and the short-term interactions that give colour and occasion to our lives. Our own work, the small projects that we undertake, just the work of a day perhaps, or on other short timescales, the longer efforts that take years and may fail, but hopefully will succeed, creating something, achieving something. Connections and attachments to other people, as I said a moment ago, but also to places and scenes, landscapes, a favourite wood or a beach, or more splendid scenes, the things that take us outside of ourselves and which we respond to. And ourselves. The pursuit of our own pleasure and fulfilment, but also personal development in a less hedonistic, wholly hedonistic way. These are the areas in which meaning is to be found in this life. And I think a very important thing is that a humanist doesn't shy away from that last point, from the pursuit of pleasure as a goal and as a source of meaning in our existence. You'll all be familiar with the pre-Christian humanist philosopher Epicurus, whose name has gone on to be, quite unfairly, to be a byword for a certain sort of reckless hedonism. And even in his own time, he had to defend his hedonistic philosophy against charges of libertinism. And he did this quite well, I think. He said, "When I say that pleasure is the goal of living, I do not mean the pleasures of libertines. I mean, on the contrary, the pleasure that consists of freedom from pain and mental agitation. Pleasant life is not the product of one drinking party after another, or of sexual intercourse with women and young men," he was Greek, or of the seafood or other delicacies afforded by the serious table. On the contrary, pleasure is the result of sober thinking. Well, these words of Epicurus demonstrate how timeless are criticisms of the pursuit of pleasure, and they provide a defense of the pursuit of happiness. And humanists of today typically echo Epicurus. But I think they wouldn't do so wholeheartedly, because some of the pleasures of the flesh are part of the good life. They are a source of meaning in our own existences, and pointless self-denial is to be avoided. Physical sensation is a pleasure in itself and a stimulus to other pleasures. The enjoyment of food and drink, of sex, of sport, all fall into this category of activity that gives colour to our lives. Equally, of course, pleasure does come from creativity, from relationships with others, from intellectual endeavour, and a plethora of other sources. But balance and moderation in the pursuit of them are equally important, or, of course, pleasures cease to be pleasures. Not believing in any one meaning of life, humanists accept that ideas of happiness and fulfillment vary from person to person, always have done and they always will. And the fact that human life on this view becomes richly diverse, creative and adventurous is celebrated by humanists as enriching the whole of humanity. Not to have one single purpose or meaning to all human lives and to the universe, I think, is a source of great interest and colour in the whole tapestry of human existence. And John Stuart Mill, a humanist philosopher of the 19th century, put this, I think, very well in a passage that's worth quoting in full from his On Liberty, which is a great statement of the humanist view of both life and politics. Human nature is not a machine built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing. It is not by wearing down into uniformity all that is individual in themselves, but by cultivating it and calling it forth within the limits imposed by the rights and interests of others, that human beings become a noble and a beautiful object of contemplation. And as the works partake the character of those who do them, by the same process, human life also becomes rich, diversified, and animating, furnishing yet more abundant fodder to high thoughts and elevated feelings. In proportion to the development of his individuality, each person becomes more valuable to himself and is therefore capable of being more valuable to others. There is a greater fullness of life about his own existence, and where there is more life in the units, there is more in the mass which is composed of them. And I apologise for the his and the he. In spite of introducing the first bill into Parliament to give votes to women, John Stuart Mill still followed the Victorian example of using the male pronoun. Nonetheless, his words, I think, are no less beautiful for that. The importance of personal development as an essential element of meaning-making in this life comes across clearly in all the work of John Stuart Mill, and I think we've probably all experienced it once. I'm certainly experiencing it in my mid-30s. Once life is well underway and 2 or 3 decades have gone by, the introspective human being is conscious of him or herself as a complicated personality. And humanists would want to call attention to this truth about the human person and proceed from this to encourage conscious self-development. Some humanist philosophers have defined this as the pursuit of the whole person. Janine Fowler writes very beautifully about this. Achieving one's full potential in skills, abilities, moral development, and psychological well-being is to become a whole person. Finding ways to encourage this fullness of being is an important part of a humanist agenda. And there are many ways in which personal development and happiness are pursued on a humanist view, and that would fill volumes. But I want to dwell just for a moment on the idea of connections, because I think this is an extremely important way in which we make some of the deepest and most profoundly affecting meanings in our lives. In the pursuit of happiness and personal development, this idea of connections persists in humanist thought, connectedness both to other people and to the non-human world. The human person, we know, doesn't exist in isolation, but always in community with others. And many humanists would place a very high value on those interpersonal relationships. Epicurus, again, of all the things that wisdom provides for the happiness of the whole person, by far the most important is the acquisition of friends. And closing that virtuous circle of happiness and personal development, the importance of connecting with others is often coupled with the importance of knowing yourself. The great humanist novelist E.M. Forster, in his now famous injunction to only connect, carries this force, referring both to the need for a meaningful life to connect with others, but also to have an integrated personality oneself. One of my predecessors as Chief Executive of the British Humanist Association tried to put this in a nutshell when he said 50 years ago, you have to be friends with yourself before you're fit to be a friend to others. And the same sentiment is found in humanists of every time and place. Positive relationships with others are such an important part of the meaningful life. Beyond our connection with the others who are our immediate living companions in this world, humanists urge us to realise and develop connections with the broader human story. Nigel Warburton, a humanist philosopher, points out that we're doing this all the time, even to the extent that we allow our pursuit of meaning and our attribution of meaning to spill out beyond the human world into quite other objects. He says, think of how we value objects that have been in touch with people now dead over indistinguishable objects of the same type. A pen that belonged to a favourite uncle or a grandmother's wedding ring. The object's particular histories do not usually leave traces on those objects, but we treat them as if they have done. We see the meaning in them and we treat them as special as a result. And that's just one micro way in which we're doing this all the time. We put the meaning in to those objects just as we do to every other experience that we have that we see as meaningful. And many other humanists, and I feel this myself when I think about our place or my place in the world, stress how fulfilling it is to develop a sense of connectedness with the people who went before us, who stretched behind our own generation as our ancestors. Through a knowledge of their ways, it helps to situate you in a broader story that gives a sense of significance and meaning to your own brief existence. And maybe even to feel the same sort of attachment through imagining the chain of our descendants into the future. That's a great source, can be a great source of positional meaning in relation to those other people. Connectedness comes into our meaning-making not only in relation to human beings, present and past and future, but also connectedness with the rest of the natural world. And I think we encounter this when we look at stars, or when we look up, if we've been lucky to do so, at a giant redwood, or even in the face of a pet or other animal, on a mountain, on a hill, by a stream, in a wood, wherever it is that we feel that connection. And these can be amongst our profoundest experiences in life. Some of our most profound experiences are those moments of encountering nature and seeming to step outside ourselves in the way that we're drawn to those experiences. And then, of course, making them part of ourselves as well, weaving them into our own memories and the fabric of our own lives, and taking those feelings and having them in a more meaningful way in the future too. Here's one humanist scientist. There are objects and occasions which invoke in me a profound sense of the sacred, and I can cite other humanist scientists of whom this is also true. Why, when you go to the Grand Canyon and you see the strata of geological time laid out before you, why is there that feeling that brings you close to tears? Or looking at the images from the Hubble telescope, it's no different from the feeling of being moved to tears by music, by a Schubert quartet, say, or by poetry. The human mind is big enough and imaginative enough to be poetically moved by the whole sweep of geological ages represented by the rocks that you are standing among. That's why you feel in awe. And many people, I think, would agree with those words of Richard Dawkins about the way in which the human mind responds to the outside world and makes meaning. Those moments of seemingly standing outside or transcending ourselves can come within the human world as well as from without them. Engagement with the products of human imagination and creativity, either our own or others, is another ingredient of the good life and something that gives it meaning. And I think at a time when the role of science and the involvement of scientists has come to play a large part in popular conceptions of the humanist approach, this is worth emphasising. It may be appreciation of art for its own sake, or it may be that valuing the fact that art obliges us, as one humanist put it, and this is the last long quote that I'm going to make, a humanist called Kieran Ryan, to grasp human experience in the fullest sense historically as a particular concrete experience situated in a particular space at a particular point in time. This is what art obliges us to do. It invites us to understand being human not as a fixed and unchanging, immutable condition, but as a changing and changeable process, a matter not of being, but of becoming. At its most potent, moreover, art can change hearts and minds in ways that accelerate this process. It can do this by exposing the gulf that yawns between what human beings are currently like and what they are capable of becoming. And that particular author goes on to quote 3 passages of Shakespeare that make vivid certain issues in a way that is calculated to change minds. Many other dimensions of human life and experience give scope for fulfillment and personal development, and there are as many occupations as there are human beings, as I say. This beautiful and dynamic process of living and of personal development can bring a conscious sense of satisfaction, and the development of our full potential is also a benefit to others. We can enrich the lives of those we love, those we connect with, and those who connect with us. We should be the best we can, not just because it will make us happy, but because that way we can be the best for others too. Other people matter. We depend on them as they depend on us, and we're all vulnerable to each other in this world. Just like other social animals, the normal human being has altruistic instincts that we've built upon, of course, across the world in different cultures, in different ways at different times. But by giving full rein to this compassion and thinking carefully for ourselves about the effects of our actions on others, we can make the choices that we face in our life, the making of which we all have ultimate responsibility for, whether we choose to contract that responsibility out or not. in a way best calculated to bring happiness to others as well as to ourselves. So the whole question of meaning in life for me is tied together in this way. What we do, who we do it with, who we are. These are the ingredients of meaning as we embark on the adventure of our lives. We come into this life as we leave it, as an individual. But in embarking on this adventure, we're not alone. We have family, we have friends, we have colleagues and companions on the journey of our lives. We also have the accumulated wisdom and opinions of the people who've lived before us, a rich human tradition of reflection that is global and millennia old, to be found in millions of stories, plays, pictures, sculptures, buildings, philosophies, poems, histories, laws, and songs. In matters of meaning, humanity is more than self-sufficient. The rich humanist traditions of East and West, responsible for so much progress in human welfare and fulfillment throughout time, are testament to that. And the many, many millions of non-religious people living happy and meaningful lives today are testament to it, just as are the lives of the millions that went before us. Why do I get up in the morning? Well, because I have things to do. People to see, books to read, campaigns to wage, injustices to try to put right, children to raise, parents to care for, walks to take, holidays to look forward to, debates to take part in, a garden to tend. In life, the meaning comes in living. To live as richly and fully as I can, and to help others to do the same. I get up for that. I think you do too. And that's all we need.
So thank you very much, Andrew. Our next speaker is Andy Bannister, and you have 25 minutes for your opening statement. Thank you.
Wonderful. And if we could just have the... oh, wonderful. Look at that. The slides up. Fantastic. Well, good evening. It's a privilege, a great honour to be with you at the University of Hull this evening. Also, a special privilege for me to be the first time visiting this incredible city of culture, but also a tinge of sadness as well, because home for me is now Dundee. And we came second in the competition to be City of Culture 2017. So when I told friends, Scottish friends, that I was coming to Hull, there were dark words I muttered and I said, next year, lads, next year. It's also thrilled to visit the birthplace of one of my great heroes, William Wilberforce, on whom I've written and spoken many, many times. And just as Wilberforce's battle against the slave trade was no mere flight of political fancy, it really, really mattered. So tonight's topic, can life have meaning without God, I think really, really matters. Because just like the question, is freedom a basic human right? The question, does life actually have meaning, is hugely important. I think actually Andrew and I will agree on that. It gets to the heart of what it means to be human. Now, to illustrate, though, how important the question is, but also a little bit how problematic it is, imagine that your phone were to buzz in your pocket right now. I'm sure you've all been very good and turned it off, but, just imagine that you haven't been one of those respectable people. You've left your iPhone on, it buzzes, and a text message pops up on your phone like this one. It says, cancel everything, says your friend. Meet me tomorrow at Starbucks at 9 a.m. What would you text back? Probably you text back, Starbucks? What do you think I am, made of money? No, probably you text back something like this. You text back the question, why? Why do you want to meet me? In other words, you'd ask your friend to justify that hour of your time. I'm a busy person, I've got things to do, places to be, gardens to attend to, got all kinds of things to do. Why do you want to meet me? In other words, you'd ask that person to justify that hour of your time. Well, it's sobering, isn't it? That unless you can answer the question, what is the meaning of life, you can't justify your entire existence. Interesting. The great Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl once wrote these words. He wrote, as the struggle for survival has subsided, this question has emerged. Survival for what? Ever more people today have the means to live, but no meaning to live for. And I think that's profoundly true. He's really put his finger on something here, that the meaning of life is hugely significant. Simply saying there is no meaning, make it up as you go along, can cause all kinds of problems. In fact, back in 2013, the atheist Douglas Murray had a debate, a dialogue with you, Andrew, I recall, at the University of Cambridge. And in that debate, Douglas Murray, who's an atheist, said something very interesting to Andrew. He said, is it just possible that if you tell people enough that they live a meaningless life, in a meaningless universe, in a meaningless existence, that you might just get something like a perpetual version of The Only Way is Essex? My wife is from Brentwood, so I have a lot of respect for people from that part of the country, but you see the point. You see, the question of the meaning of life is important. In fact, it's also crucial, because the answer you have to what is life's meaning is particularly important when adversity or suffering strikes you, as it invariably will. So if you're living in Aleppo right now, or Somalia, or maybe closer to home, maybe one of you this evening is wrestling with a painful bereavement or a terrifying medical diagnosis, then the question of what life is really about, what life's purpose really is, takes on a crucial weight and importance. The atheist Friedrich Nietzsche summed this up beautifully when he wrote this incredible statement. He said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." Now, of course, Nietzsche was an atheist, and that raises the question that we're going to tease out and explore a little bit tonight, of how life can have meaning if we are just atoms and particles, if we are just generated by the same forces of physics and chemistry and biology as Andrew alluded to, if we are, as Professor Richard Dawkins remarks, just dancing to our DNA. Now, interestingly, many atheists would agree with me that you can't have meaning in life without God. Listen to these words from one of the most famous atheists of the last 50 years or so, Bertrand Russell, one of the greatest atheist thinkers of the 20th century. And a very famous paragraph. It's lengthy, but we need to hear what he says. Let me read you his comment on this question. He writes, "Man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and his fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. No fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. All the labours of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system." Cheerful stuff, this, isn't it? And the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Bleak stuff. And if I had a time machine, I could go back in history and drink beer with any one philosopher from the philosophical tradition, I don't think I'd pick Bertrand Russell. Epicurus might actually be higher on my list, but I admire his honesty. I admire his courage. I admire his willingness to face up to the fact that atheism has some entailments. As another atheist, Jean-Paul Sartre, once put it, atheism, he said, is a long, hard, cruel business. By contrast, there is today a tendency for some contemporary forms of atheism and secularism to adopt perhaps a more kind of Pollyanna quality, to claim that, hey, there is no God, we are just atoms and particles dancing to our DNA, battered around by the forces of physics, but, we can still have meaning without God. And I think Andrew did a spectacularly eloquent job of setting out that position tonight. He did so with eloquence and clarity and passion. Of course, that passion reminds us that humanism is a religious position. It's no accident, of course, that the very first edition of the Humanist magazine, published in the 1920s, had a front-page editorial on the religion of humanism, based, as they put it, on faith in man. Now, I don't say that to be pejorative, simply to remind you, members of the audience this evening, that there are two religious positions on the stage this evening, two positions being set out, that you're hearing a discussion between humanism and Christianity. So then, can you say that life can have meaning if there is no God? Or is that just blind faith, blind fideism? Well, I think that if there is no God, life cannot have meaning. And if there is no God, you can't simply invent your own meaning, which was Andrew's position, create your own meaning. In fact, I think there are three very good reasons why if there is no God and no meaning baked into reality, you can't simply create your own a la carte style. Let me show you 3 reasons why. First reason why you can't create your own meaning and just make it up is that it's a very post-truth approach to philosophy. Hey, the universe is meaningless, but hey, let's just pretend otherwise and carry on regardless. It will be okay. But with every due respect to Andrew, the universe doesn't acquire meaning just because we shout that it does. I may find the law of gravity deeply inconvenient when I just want to flap my arms and fly to the top of the nearest Munro when I'm climbing 3,000 footers in Scotland, but unfortunately I'm stuck with gravity. And if the universe is meaningless, we're stuck with it. And in fact, to claim otherwise isn't merely foolishness, it's hubris. British Humanist Association patron Richard Dawkins, very honestly, I think, wrote these words. He said, "We should not think there's anything special about us. We used to think we're the centre of the universe, and now we know that we are not." Or as the poet Stephen Crane put it more artistically, he wrote this little poem. He said, "A man said to the universe, 'Sir, I exist.' 'However,' replied the universe, 'that fact has not created in me a sense of obligation.'" If the universe has no meaning, we may dislike it. We may rage against it poetically, as Andrew has, and talk about the wonders of gardening and getting up in the morning. But we're stuck with it, and we have to live with it. Problem number 1. Second problem with saying we can create our own meaning is that it raises a question of what happens when our different meanings clash, and clash profoundly. Let's engage in a thought experiment this evening. Let's imagine that our MC this evening, Martin, decides that he's going to invent a meaning to life for himself, and he's going to embrace the cause of environmentalism. In particular, he decides he's going to try and save as many cute little baby seals as possible. Who wouldn't want to try and save that? Wonderful and cute and beautiful. Well, Andrew, on the other hand, he decides he's going to pick a different meaning to life. The meaning to life he's going to embrace is going to be reviving the fur trade. And basically his plan is to club as many of the cute little critters to death as possible and sell their pelts for a high profit on eBay. Now see the problem. We have 2 very competing meanings to life here. Andrew's meaning to life, Martin's meaning to life are so different there is no reconciling them. Now, the one thing we can't do is appeal upwards and say, well, you should do this or you shouldn't do that, because we've already admitted there is no meaning baked into the universe. And in fact, probably the only thing we can do is either let these gentlemen fight it out, in which case my money's on Andrew, he's a bit younger, and or we have to actually be careful, because Martin might be buying drinks afterwards. Exactly, my time is up. Or what we have to do is we smuggle in values from elsewhere. We say, sort of distract people and say, just look this way a moment while we open the door and drag in some value from outside our atheism. And the problem is that kind of value judgment smuggling is all very well. And I think with respect, it was all over Andrew's talk. There were lots of oughts and shoulds and this is good and you should do this and not this. And I think in the Q&A, we can push in a little bit to where those values are being smuggled from. But there's a third, even more profound problem. I think we're trying to create your own meaning, and I think it shows with respect that we don't really know, if we claim we can do that, what we mean by meaning, to pardon the pun for a moment. Again, let me illustrate the problem with throwing the word meaning around without defining it for a moment. Consider A.C. Grayling's book, The God Argument. That's one of Andrew's recommendations to the book table this evening. So if my illustration encourages you to go read it, then I shall be writing to Anthony and asking for 10% commission. What's the meaning of Grayling's book, The God Argument? Well, suppose I read it, and in a flight of fancy, the meaning that I find in that book, the meaning that's there for me, the meaning that I create, I decide it's a cookery book. And based upon his philosophical explorations, I invent a culinary cornucopia of cakes and desserts and trifles and puddings. One of you in the audience, though, come along and you look at Anthony's book, and the meaning that you find there, the meaning that you create, the meaning that makes you feel good, that gets you up in the morning, is you decide it's a book of taxidermy. And it inspires you to take up stuffing dead animals with sand. And soon every shelf in your study is filled with a glassy-eyed menagerie. Now, in due course, perhaps we bump into each other in the pub, and lo and behold, we start arguing about the meaning to be found in the book. It's a cookery book, I say. Get stuffed, you say. It's about taxidermy. Quality jokes this evening. As we're rolling around the floor, grappling, who should walk in the door but Anthony Grayling himself, who happens to be in Hull, and he says, what are you two idiots arguing about? And we say, we're arguing about the meaning of the book. And he pipes up and says, well, hang on, let me sort it out for you two jokers. I am the author of the book, The God Argument. I can tell you the meaning of the book. And of course, being the author, postmodern protests to the contrary, Anthony does have the right to determine the meaning of the book. On the other hand, if the book The God Argument was simply created ex nihilo by somebody throwing a hand grenade into the Scrabble factory and the letter tiles falling randomly so they spelt out what we now know as the God Argument, then there is no meaning in the book, right? There is no meaning built into it. The only meaning to be found is what you or I read into it. And that's all very well. But then claiming that we have found the meaning, or that my meaning is superior to your meaning, is utter nonsense. No author, no meaning. And I would say the same goes for life and the universe and reality. If there is a God behind it, we can talk about meaning, we can use that term. If there isn't, and we are just nothing more than the random forces of time plus chance plus natural selection operating deterministically through the forces of physics and chemistry over 14 odd billion years, then at the end of the day, we can have all kinds of lovely discussions, but the word meaning is value smuggling. See, the problem is we use words like meaning very sloppily, and that's where we get confused. Let's try and untangle this a little bit in my last 10 minutes. The psychologist Roy Baumeister, very well-regarded American psychologist, wrote a really helpful little book a few years ago called Meanings of Life. And in that book, he argues, he says, the problem with the question, what's the meaning of life, it's too big a question. We need to break it down to get behind it. And we need to answer 4 other basic questions first. We need to answer the question of identity. Who am I? We need to answer the question of value. What am I worth? We need to answer the question of purpose. Why am I here? And we need to answer the question of agency. Can I make a difference? And he says, unless we can answer those 4 basic questions, we can't answer the question, the meaning of life. It's simply an illusion. Now, those 4 questions that he helpfully breaks the bigger question down into, I think begin to show why, on atheism or humanism, that you can't really answer the question, the meaning of life. You can play language games, for sure, until the cows go home. But in terms of actually answering the question, one can't do it. Let me illustrate what I mean. Take Baumeister's first category. Take the identity question. If Andrew's atheism is true, what is the answer to the question, what are we? Who are we as human beings? Well, the atheist physicist Lawrence Krauss put it pretty bluntly, really, in purely physical terms. He said we are a 1% bit of pollution within the universe. We are completely insignificant. So I'm sorry if you walked in here this evening thinking you were a 10% bit of pollution in the universe. I've taken down your self-esteem by 10%, by a considerable factor. Now, that may be grim. We may not like it. We may protest. We may grumble and throw derogatory remarks at Professor Krauss. But that doesn't mean it isn't true if atheism holds. What about the value question? Well, again, on atheism, we're in trouble here. How do we ground any sense of human value? Andrew tried to kind of make a differentiation between human beings and other animals, but it's problematic. On atheism, it really is hard to say why human beings have value. Are you the sum of your chemical components? Are you worth what you earn? Is your value the sum total of your friendship groups, both your real friends and the pretend ones you have on social media? And where is your value located? Atheist philosopher Raymond Gator presses into this problem. He very honestly admitted this. He said, we may say that all human beings are inestimably precious, that they are ends in themselves, that they are owed unconditional respect, that they possess inalienable rights, and of course that they possess inalienable dignity. In my judgment, he says, these are just ways of trying to say what we feel a need to say when we are estranged from the conceptual resources we need to say it. Be that as it may, each is problematic and contentious. Not one of them has the simple power of religious ways of speaking. We hit similar problems not just with identity, with value. We hit a similar problem when it comes to purpose on an atheistic view of things. Asking if a human life has a purpose is rather like looking at the pile of leaves that the wind has blown there on the pavement and asking, what's the purpose of the pile of leaves? And the answer is it has none. It's just been blown there by the wind. It's just an accident. And you and I are in exactly the same position. You are a chemical accident. You are a random collection of atoms, as Bertrand Russell informed us. And of course, that raises all kinds of huge problems, because if you don't know the purpose of a thing, how can you talk about a right or wrong use of it? Andrew, on a number of occasions, implied there were sort of right ways and wrong ways to use a life. He spoke very powerfully about compassion, and I respect him for that. But of course, if we are just the result of time plus chance plus chemistry plus physics, there is no right nor wrong way to use a collection of atoms. We can't talk about the purpose of a life on atheism. And then finally, the question of agency. If atheism is true, can your life make a difference? Well, frankly, no. Many of you in this room are probably familiar with the French atheist philosopher Albert Camus and his famous retelling of the story of the myth of Sisyphus, the tragic Greek hero who was sentenced to forever roll his massive rock up the hill in the underworld, and then every night, just when it almost got to the top, down it would crash, and the whole process would begin over and over and over again. And as Bertrand Russell reminded us at the start, that's where we are on atheism. What awaits us all, saint or sinner, however you choose to use your life, is death and extinction and the heat death of the universe. And if that does not force you to ask some tough questions, then I suggest you are living in Pollyanna atheism. Is there an alternative? In my last 6 minutes? Well, yes, there is, because Christianity offers a very different set of answers to those 4 questions that Roy Baumeister posed. See, on identity, the Bible and the Bible alone tells you that you are not an accident of atoms, but created in the image of God who loves you and knows you. You are not a cosmic accident. On value, the Bible tells you, Christianity tells you that you bear incredible value demonstrated by God paying a very high price for each of you in this room, the life of Jesus Christ, to offer you forgiveness and restoration and wholeness. And on purpose, the Bible says, yes, there is a purpose to life, to know God, not a moral system or a religion or a philosophy even, but to know God and enjoy him forever. And on agency, the Bible says, our strivings and our very best can outlive us if they get caught up in and become part of God's bigger, good purposes to restore and renew creation. That's a Christian view of things. Is it a religious view of things? Well, in one sense, I guess, yes, it is, in the same sense that Andrew's humanism is a religious view of things. And you see, I find it fascinating that human beings can't avoid religion. There is simply no escaping it, because each of us as human beings is born to worship. And if we don't worship God and find our identity in him, and in him our meaning and our identity, we will try and find it elsewhere, and that's where the problems start. The Pulitzer Prize-nominated novelist, David Foster Wallace, if you're a literature student here this evening, his name will be known to you instantly, I imagine. An atheist. But he once wrote something very profound on this question I'd like to quote to you as I bring this to a close. Listen to his words. He writes, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will always end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. What Wallace is nudging at here is that whatever is the source of your meaning and your satisfaction, your joy and your energy, well, you have to have it. You need it, and you're afraid of losing it. And because of that, the prospect of losing whatever it is, your academic reputation, that particular relationship, your job, your standard of living, that thing ends up controlling you. And the problem is that if you serve your career or success or sex or whatever it is and you fail, it will end up crucifying you inside with hatred and jealousy and self-loathing. By contrast, the heart of the Christian faith stands the news that Jesus was crucified for you. I gave a version of this talk at the University of Toronto the first time 2 years ago. I used to live in Canada. And at the end of the evening, we had a time of Q&A, like we're going to have tonight in a few minutes' time. And the first person to the microphone was the head of the Secular Alliance. And his opening question was fascinating. I think I'll remember it to the day I die. He came to the mic, and I expected a hostile response, but it wasn't. He looked at me and he said, "Andy, you have, in tonight's talk, convinced me of something." He said, "I've been suspecting for a long time, through my reading of atheist philosophy, that my atheism entails meaninglessness, that if there is no God, life can have no meaning. I've tried to avoid it, but I think I now have to face it, and I think that is the reality. I'm trying to live with that as an atheist, but just because life is grim and absurd without God does not prove that Christianity is true." My reply was that I agreed, but I did say that if one has worked out that if atheism is true, it has some pretty drastic entailments, that should surely motivate you to properly investigate the Christian faith. When Martin first reached out to Andrew and I a few months ago and asked if we'd take part in tonight's dialogue, the proposed topic was actually, does God exist? And I wrote back and I said, you know what, I'd love to dialogue with Andrew. I've watched many of his talks. I respect and admire his passion and what he's doing at the BHA. But I said the topic, does God exist, can very easily become a philosophical sideshow. And I suggested, if Andrew was amenable, I said, why don't we do instead tonight's topic, can life have meaning without God? Because I believe it's only when you've realised the dire consequences of atheism for the question of meaning that's so important to us that you can really be motivated to look hard at Christianity. And I hope tonight, in my 25 minutes, I have begun to help some of you see why that is just so important. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Andy. So we now come to the response stage of the debate, where each speaker can respond to what the other one has said. So first off will be Andrew, and you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I probably won't use the full 10 minutes, I suspect, as Andy is. I'm looking forward more to the questions. To take the third of Andy's points first, I think it certainly does seem to be the case that we're both using the word meaning in quite different ways. And it does seem to be the case that neither of us believes in the possibility of the meaning that the other one does believe in. I think that meaning is something that is created and sustained by human beings as they attribute it to their experiences in this world. And Andy believes it to be something that is implicit, baked in, as he said, implying a baker, of course, baked in to the universe. And they may well be irreconcilable ideas of what meaning is. Let's hope that the discussion won't be as fruitless as that, and we will be able to achieve at least some illumination around some of these questions. But I think that that's plausible, that we both have just completely different conceptions of what meaning in our lives might be. I'll talk in a moment about the three problems that Andy listed. First of all, I want to say something about uncertainty and suffering, because at the very beginning of what Andy said, he raised the problem that in this world there is great pain and great suffering, and if you're standing here now, you talk about Aleppo. If you were standing here 60 years ago, you talk about whatever disaster, natural or human-made, is happening in the world, and you point to it and you say, look at all this pain and suffering. Well, human life is full of pain and suffering, that is true. Some of it we can avoid, some of it, unfortunately, we can't. I think that the existence of pain and suffering calls for a certain sober realism about what it's possible for human beings to do and what it's not possible for us to do to make life and the world better, and it calls for courage, so that we can take on this pain and suffering and help to alleviate it. But I can't see that it bears particularly on the question of meaning. Because if life is full of pain and suffering, and that's the only life that some people have. If it's true, it's true. We may wish it weren't so, but wishing that something weren't so doesn't make it the case. So although there is uncertainty and suffering and pain in the world, I can't see that it bears on the question of meaning. It may make things very sad. It may make us more likely to see human existence as a tragedy rather than as a ceaseless comedy, but I don't think it makes us think that there must necessarily be some deeper meaning behind it, even if we wished that there were. There is a paradox at the heart of human existence, I think. Human life, every human life, is a complete tragedy. We spend decades, hopefully decades, building up these complicated personalities, these tapestries of experience that eventually will dissipate into nothing. And even the traces that we leave at the end of those lives that we may leave in terms of achievements or works that we leave behind us, or children and grandchildren, or good memories in the minds of our friends and family, even those traces will also dissipate. And of course, one day the last human being will die. Hopefully not too soon, but you never know the way things are going. And that is a tragedy. Human life is a complete tragedy. But it's also a great adventure in each of our own personal experiences, and it is both these things simultaneously. And that is a paradox at the heart of our existence, if we think hard about it, and if we don't think there's any life to come, as I don't, and as people in humanists today and in the humanist tradition don't. And since we're quoting Bertrand Russell, such a terrible thing for a devout humanist to become an authority to quote textually in this way. But if we are quoting him, then Andy quoted him very sensibly in what he said about the cosmic significance of human beings, which is zero, or close to zero. But Bertrand Russell too pointed out the paradox when he asked, is man what he seems to be to the physicists, the people who are looking out into the universe, or is he what he seems to be to Hamlet? And the answer, of course, is that he is both. Those things are true both at the same time. Life is very complicated. It can be seen from many, many angles and framed in many, many ways. There is no single answer to the question of our experience in that sense. Well, moving through Andy's 3 points. Firstly, the universe doesn't acquire meaning just because we say so. I absolutely agree. And it's no part of anything that I've said to imply somehow that we can give the universe meaning or the universe has any meaning. In fact, the central point of what I would like to say is that the question of the meaningless or not of the universe is irrelevant to the question of the meaningfulness or not of human lives. There's a good joke about this. There's a physicist, conference of physicists. I better be careful, actually, because you're a physicist, aren't you? So maybe they're not physicists. People, whoever's professional field it is to look at stars. Who looks at stars in their professional field? Starologists. Astrophysicist conference. And there's a panel at the front, and these people are talking, a bit like here. And all of a sudden, after one of the speakers has finished his remarks, a man right at the back looks very panicked, and he's waving, and he wants the first question. So the moderator says, well, you clearly, that's going to add some colour to this, so you're quite agitated. We'll choose your question first. And he says, excuse me, Professor, did you just say, I want to be sure I heard you right, did you just say that the sun is going to explode in 3 million years and destroy the Earth? Is that what you said? The professor says, no, I said 3 billion years. Oh, thank goodness, says the man right at the back. And whenever I hear someone trying to tie individual human existence to, the scale of the universe, I think of that agitated man, agitated to no great purpose. At compound discount, it can't possibly be relevant to your individual life what the ultimate fate of the universe is. That's not what's going to give you purpose or a sense of meaning in your relatively mayfly-ish existence. It's a religious habit to link the nature of reality with the meaningfulness of human lives with the question of morality. These three things are linked by strong habits of mind, especially in Europe, influenced by Christianity in particular. But they don't have to be linked together. I don't link them together. Large cultures outside of the Christian West, for example, China, for the majority of its last 3,000 years' history, has not linked these three things together in this way. It's a nice verbal trick to talk about the pointlessness of the universe and therefore say that surely that would mean that human lives are pointless, but it doesn't logically follow at all. The second question, well, what happens when different meanings clash? Well, when different meanings clash, we have problems. That's absolutely true. As we see all around us every day in our lives, in the world. That's why laws exist. That's why codes of ethics have been developed. That's why we struggle together to live together in society and have a conversation with ourselves about what's right, what's wrong, who we protect, who we don't protect, what we do to try and correct injustice, how we work for a better world, or how some people try to protect their own interests. How can we have greater equality? How can we have a better global settlement between rich and poor? How can we structure society to try and make sure that people's happiness is maximised rather than not? That's the real world. We've all got experience of that. People's meanings do clash. I don't see why that's an argument that instead of that there should be some bigger background meaning. That, again, that logically just doesn't seem to follow at all. And again, I think that it's a religious habit to link questions of meaning with questions of morality and right and wrong. And these two things, to me, I think are more properly quite separate human domains, quite separate domains of human life. They may be linked. There may be people who dedicate their entire lives solely to philanthropic or charitable endeavours, and that is a way of making meaning, and a lot of us would think they were praiseworthy. But they're not the same thing. And then, as I said at the very beginning, the third point about what not knowing what we mean by meaning, and needing to define it, and the claim that I had been sloppy or had failed to do so, I'll just repeat what I said right at the beginning. As far as I'm concerned, meaning is that thing that is produced inside ourselves, in our mind, as we give significance to our experience. It's what we live for, it's what gives us a sense of position and place and purpose. So that does seem to be a very different sort of thing, a very different sort of definition of meaning from the one that Andy is using. Andy obviously believes that meaning can only be meaning, real meaning, if it is about the life, the universe and everything, and this one answer that gives you everything a la carte, as I was accused of being. But I think it's the Christian view that's more properly described as being so easily read off from some pre-existing pattern or script. Those two different sources of meaning, types of ways of thinking about meaning, might be something that we can more fruitfully discuss in questions and answers, but I'll leave my response there. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Andrew. And Andy will finish with the response session, so you've got 10 minutes.
Fantastic. Could we have the PowerPoint back up again as well, if that's possible, because a couple of quotes I wanted to show. Thanks folks. Fantastic. Okay, I'll come to that in a moment. It's interesting. It's interesting that we agree on finding kind of Bertrand Russell interesting. I mean, he was a wonderfully fascinating atheist. He once remarked on the conclusions of his atheism towards the end of his life. He wrote, "The centre of me is always in a kind of wild pain," as I think he reflected on where his atheism was taking him. Really interesting to study his life. But he's not the only one who recognises there are some problems here. Let me read to you something that Stephen Jay Gould, very famous evolutionary biologist, once remarked about the human condition, because I think it sheds a bit of light on some of the things that Andrew has been saying. Gould writes this: answering the question, why are we here as human beings? He says, we are here because one odd group of fishes had a particular fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures, because comets struck the Earth and wiped out dinosaurs, thereby giving mammals a chance not otherwise available. So thank your lucky stars in a literal sense. Because the Earth never froze entirely during an ice age, not even in Scotland. Because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa a 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these answers ourselves from our own wisdom and ethical sense. There is no other way. I like that quotation because it's sort of honest as an issue, but again, tries to skirt around it, rather like Andrew's done this evening. Because if you watch carefully, Stephen is playing a little bit fast and loose. Because if the biological facts are true, You can't simply, as Stephen tries here, or Andrew tried, well, there's actually two ways of describing human beings. Yes, they're biology. Oh, you said, but there are other things as well. If the science holds true, if we are just physics and chemistry and biology, then some things follow. There are some implications. Not least, that freedom and desire for autonomy that's so much at the heart of how Andrew argues, and Grayling, if you read Grayling's book. Of course, it begs the question, are we free? Is that consciousness that Andrew places such weight in just itself a chemical reaction? Is someone like the great atheist neuroscientist Patricia Churchland correct when she says, when you boil it all down, the organisms like us are really just concerned with the 4 Fs: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and reproducing. Truth, whatever that is, takes the hindmost. So I think there's quite a divorce here between Andrew's embrace of the sciences, love of the sciences, I love the sciences, and what he's trying to construct there. I think we should tease that out in the Q&A. I want to say as well, that little idea that, those of us who are Christians like myself are trying to peg individual human meaning to the end of the universe, skirting nicely around the fact that it was Bertrand Russell, who I think is on his team, who was doing that. You can make that a more immediate issue. Analogy that's sometimes used in moral philosophy is, let's imagine that you're standing on the Titanic just as it's about to sink beneath the waves. Everybody else has gone. Even Leonardo DiCaprio has sunk, finally, beneath the icy waves, although there was definitely room for both of them on that plank, but that's another debate. Thank you, one person who got that joke. And there you are, there's you and there's one other person beside each other on the Titanic, and you realise that you've maybe got 2 minutes to live before, bang, you're gone. And it occurs to you, I could hug my fellow passenger, or I could whack them over the head and steal their wallet. Hugging or mugging, what difference does it make? The answer is none at all, because you're fish food either way. And so whether you peg the problem of human significance to the end of time, as Bertrand Russell did, or you make it more immediate, I think you run into the same kind of problem. And then I think the other problem as well that we stumble across, and I think we should have some real fun with this in the Q&A, concerns the whole question of values and where they come from. I quoted you Raymond Gator earlier. I'm just going to page through a few slides here that we don't have time for. But there's a particular story I want to tell you that brings out something really interesting that I want to get to here. You know, it's interesting that where we are right now in history, we are just a few years ago. We are just a few years out from a really interesting piece of history. In fact, last week was the anniversary of a very, very significant couple of people who are heroes to mine. I don't know how many of you have heard of the White Rose Group, if that means anything to anybody. They were a group of students in Germany during the time of the Third Reich. And their story is interesting. Let me just find the quotation for you. I have it here. 1 second. Here we go. So, the Scholls, Hans and Sophie, there on the screen behind me, were university students back in the 1940s. In fact, if you were to visit Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, you'd find a plaza dedicated to their memory. They were a German brother and sister who in 1941, while at university, became Christians, and they quickly realised that their newfound faith had some implications. They had to take a stand against the Third Reich. And that meant, with the help of a teacher rather, they formed something called the White Rose Group, and they began distributing anti-Nazi leaflets. Well, on the 18th of February, 1943, so say the anniversary has just happened, Hans and Sophie brought a suitcase full of leaflets to the university. They left piles of anti-Nazi leaflets in the corridors for students to find when lectures ended. Had a few pamphlets left, and deciding they didn't want to waste them, they walked to the top of the atrium and flung them into the courtyard. Fortunately, they were spotted. The authorities were called, and the group were rounded up and arrested by the Gestapo. 4 days later, they were tried, found guilty of treason, and sentenced to death by guillotine. Sophie's last words, just before she was beheaded, were incredibly brave. She said, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give themselves up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Now, what's interesting is most of us look at their story and instantly go, this is fantastic, this is heroic, this is genuinely good. and we want to celebrate this. We build memorials to it, and whether we're humanists or theists, we go, this is a really good example of a life well lived, real bravery and courage. But it begs the question, why? And how we can answer that if simply Stephen Jay Gould or Bertrand Russell or Andrew are right, that we can just make up our own meaning as we go along. Yeah, you know what, their meaning was interesting, but the Third Reich, they had their own meaning, and we can't really assess between. It's difficult, it's complicated. You see, you can't really do ethics without answering the meaning of life question with a capital M. Andrew tried to say, well, it doesn't really matter, it's a sort of philosophical nicety. But listen to these words from Michael Sandel of Harvard University, one of the world's leading ethicists. In his book, Justice, this is what he writes. He says, debates about justice and rights are often unavoidably debates about the purpose of social institutions, the good they allocate, and the virtues they honour and reward. Despite our best efforts to make the law neutral on such questions, it may not be possible to say what is just and right without answering the question of what the good life is. And he's actually tapping philosophy here, because Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher, once said that we need to explain everything we see, everything from tables and chairs to ants and aardvarks and physicists, in 4 ways. There are 4 explanations, 4 causes of everything we see. There's the formal cause, which is a very complicated philosopher's idea. Let's put that on one side for a moment. There's the material cause. So this table, for example, is made out of wood, apart from the red button underneath it. He'll be pressing in 2.5 minutes. There's the efficient cause. Somewhere there's a factory churning out tables. But then, most importantly, and too often missed in discussions today, there is the final cause. What something is designed for. Its purpose, its telos. And it's purpose that lets us talk about good and evil. If I was to talk to you after this session this evening, and I was to say to you, I've enjoyed my time in Hull, but I'm a bit annoyed this evening. And you say, why are you cross, Andy? You look like an easygoing chap. And I say, well, I was in a jewellery store yesterday, and they sold me a bad watch. And you say, what do you mean a bad watch? I say, well, yeah, I bought this watch yesterday in Dundee, went home last night, was putting up shelves for my wife, hammering in the shelves with my watch, and I broke it. You'd probably say 2 things. One, would you like the number of a good psychiatrist here in Hull? Secondly, you've misunderstood the purpose of a watch, and I would have done. Because the purpose of a watch is to tell the time, and we determine whether it's a good watch or a bad watch by how well it does that. And we are in the same position with a human life, my friends. Unless you know what a good life is, what the purpose of a life is, then we can have highfalutin pontifications about good and evil and right and wrong and justice, but we get nowhere. You know, it's interesting that Andrew mentioned Epicurus. Around the time of Jesus of Nazareth, 1st century AD, Greek philosophy had largely split into 2 camps. So the Epicureans on one hand kind of pursuing pleasure, not unfettered hedonism, he's fair point on that, but still pursuing pleasure. On the other side you had the Stoics, a kind of grin and bear it and get on with it approach to life, almost proto-Scottish. And one of the things they argued about was the meaning of life. The Epicureans thought, the word the Greek philosophers used for the meaning of life was the word logos in Greek. The Epicureans didn't think there was a logos, hence why just pursue pleasure. The Stoics thought there was, but you can never find it, just grin and bear it. Interesting, into that huge philosophical debate. Read the start sometime of John's Gospel in the New Testament. John's Gospel opens with these words. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, the Word was God. The Word took flesh and came and walked amongst us. The word, Greek word, translated into English, word, is the Greek word logos. You see, John is saying, the New Testament is saying there is a meaning of life, but it's not an idea, it's not a philosophy, it's not a concept, it's a person, Jesus Christ, who can be known. Life is not about a what, but a whom. That is the centre of existence and life's meaning on the Christian answer to things. Thank you for listening so patiently.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of the formal part of this conversation so far. So many thanks to both speakers for your very good contributions. Before we move on to the Q&A session, I just wanted to highlight some books that have been recommended by both speakers. for those who'd like to read more about tonight's topic after the debate. So first off, Andrew Copson has recommended 2 books. The first, in fact, has already been mentioned, The God Argument by Anthony Grayling. So here's just a brief summary of the blurb. So there has been a bad-tempered quarrel between defenders and critics of religion in recent years because of the high stakes involved. This book thoroughly and calmly examines all the arguments offered in support of religious belief, and because it takes into account all the issues, its solutions carry great weight. The God Argument is the definitive statement of the humanist outlook that recommends itself as the ethics of the genuinely reflective person. The second book, recommended by Andrew Copson, is On Humanism by Richard Norman. So what is humanism and why does it matter? On Humanism is a timely and powerfully argued defense of humanism. It is also an impassioned plea that we turn to ourselves, not to religion, if we want to answer the age-old question, what is the best kind of life to lead? Richard Norman deals with big questions such as Darwinism and creation science, matter and consciousness, euthanasia and abortion, and then argues that it is ultimately through the human capacity for art, literature, and imagination that humanism is a powerful alternative to religious belief. So 2 books from Andy Bannister. The first is Making Sense of God by Tim Keller. So I'll just read you a brief summary. We live in an age of skepticism. Our society places such faith in empirical reason, historical progress, and heartfelt emotion that it's easy to wonder, why should anyone believe in Christianity? What role can faith and religion play in our modern lives? In this thoughtful and inspiring book, New York Times best-selling author Timothy Keller invites skeptics to consider that Christianity is as relevant now as ever. As human beings, we cannot live without meaning, satisfaction, freedom, identity, justice, and hope, and Christianity provides us with unsurpassed resources to meet all these needs. The second book, The Atheist Who Didn't Exist by Andrew Bannister himself. In the last decade, atheism has leapt from obscurity to the front pages. Many people now assume that a godless skepticism is the default position, indeed the only position, for anyone wishing to appear educated, contemporary, and urbane. Atheism is hip, religion is boring. Yet, when one pokes at popular atheism, many of the arguments used to prop it up quickly unravel. The Atheist Who Didn't Exist is designed to expose some of those loose threads on the cardigan of atheism. Blending humor with serious thought, Andy Bannister helps the reader question everything, assume nothing, and above all, recognize lazy skepticism and bad arguments. Okay, so those are the titles that have been recommended by the speakers tonight, and there are other titles as well on the Waterstones book table at discounted prices, so please do stay and browse after this debate. Please also visit the HUSA and Rooted in Christ information stands, where you will find free information and resources on both humanism and Christianity. So thank you very much. Right, I think we've come to the sort of exciting part of the debate, which is the question and answer session.
Not the red button.
No, there's no red button for this one, so you're okay, but keep your answers concise still. So first, on the first half, so thank you very much. There have been a number of very great questions submitted electronically or otherwise. So I will start with the submitted questions, and then later on I'll open it up to the audience for live questions, okay? So let me start first. A question, first of all, for Andy Bannister. Why does meaning of life have to be exact and not personal? Is it not personal in the same way that a novel has different meaning to an individual?
That's a phenomenal question. And I think actually it's interesting that Andrew suggested in his response section that there was 2 different models going on here this evening. I don't think they are. I think they fit together. I think you can certainly, and I wouldn't want you to be hearing me to be saying that there can't be individual meaning to life. That's not the Christian answer at all. But that meaning to life, that individual meaning to life, flows from and is definitely connected to the larger meaning of life. That's why I was pushing Andrew a little bit on the end. If atheism says, if the big answer on atheism is it is just physics and chemistry and biology, if that's what we are saying, then there is a yawning chasm between that and then going, well, I can pick my own individual meaning. Well, can't, I'm afraid. Christianity, on the other hand, says there is a big meaning to life. The purpose of life primarily is to know God and enjoy Him forever. Now, that simple little sentence unpacks in a million different ways, and it unpacks differently for each Christian, because at the end of the day, my Christian faith is not some sort of set of doctrines I sign up on, but primarily a relationship with Jesus Christ. And there are two persons on either end of that relationship, and the way that He may deal with me may be different to the way He deals with others. The book analogy is a really interesting one, and I think a helpful one. Absolutely. You can read, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or, Harry Potter, or whatever tickles your, particular fancy, and you can definitely find different meanings in a book. The book I'm reading right now is a biography of Scott, the great Antarctic explorer, connects with Dundee. My wife read it, found it boring. I read it, found it hugely interesting. But if we started disagreeing about the existence of a book, and that she said, well, I believe the book had 94 chapters, well, I think the book has 36 chapters, I think it's written in English, I think it's written in Swahili, we have a problem going on. So I think as we explore meaning, we need to balance that subjective with the objective, and we need both. But if there is no objective meaning to life, then subjective meaning collapses in utter, pardon the pun, meaninglessness.
Do you want to add anything to that question? I mean, I know it's directed to Andy. But
I don't understand the connection that's being made between some hypothetical objective meaning to reality and the subjective meaning that people would attribute to their own existence, I suppose, is my fundamental problem with what you've said. I don't understand why that should be the case. It seems just to me to be one proposition after another rather than to have followed.
Shall I
Please.
Let's do a dialogue. This is great because we're dialoguing now. Let me tease it out, for example. That's one of the things that you didn't respond to. And that's fair enough. I mean, we both covered all the material. Take Raymond Gator's point on human rights. It's dear to my heart. I know it's dear. Human rights is dear to your heart, and compassion is something you really care about. And I want to be the first to say that humanists have got a wonderful track record in that area. Here's the interesting thing: if human life has actual value and dignity, if human rights is not just some illusion, but human life actually has dignity, you actually have value, then that will affect how I respond to you. Now, some people may take that in a different way. It may be that I just treat you with generosity and buy you a beer. It may inspire others of us to go and work with Médecins Sans Frontières in some war-torn corner of the world, serving the cause of human justice. Lying behind it, though, is the same basic objective idea, that human life has value and dignity and real significance. So that's how you connect the objective with the subjective.
And you're saying that's inescapable. So even though I behave in that same way, even though I recognise the dignity of human persons, and I don't think that there's an objective necessity written into the universe to do that, that nonetheless there is, and that's what I'm really responding to.
I think
obviously that's an irrefutable proposition.
I think so.
It's only irrefutable because it doesn't offer any evidence for it. So it's not, I can't refute that because there is no way of refuting it. It's unfalsifiable. If you say, even if you, Andrew Copson, think that the good you are doing is unfettered from objective goodness in the universe, it is not so, because unbeknownst to you, there is objective goodness behind you. I can't refute that.
Good question. No, I don't think that's what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is you can definitely live inconsistently. People live inconsistently all the time.
Inconsistent, that's the
Well, for example, I mean, if I were to say that I believe in a flat Earth, and that I believe that all of the kind of theories of the Earth being a globe are nothing more than fictions designed by makers of globes who want to make a fortune selling them in Waterstones, then you catch me, booking a cruise to Australia, you would be quite right to go, Andy, how does that work? And if I look at you and go, how dare you say that I have to believe in a globe in order to take a holiday in Australia? Look, I believe in a flat Earth, and I'm going to Melbourne. Yahoo, sucks to you. I think at the very least somebody might go, And I think what Raymond Gator, who again is on your team, is pointing out it is hugely problematic to run around making statements like human life has value and dignity. We should, and the should is the problem. And I think once the should creeps in and you begin telling other people they should treat others with compassion and dignity, then I think we have every right to ask the question, where is that grounded? Is that
what you're saying to me? You're saying you, Andrew Copson, are inconsistent because on the one hand you say that people should treat each other with respect, and on the other hand, you don't believe that that's written into the universe. It's only just what you're saying. Is that your point?
I'm bringing out, I think, a gulf between some of your claims, particularly around the sciences, and then I think where you want to take it in terms of compassionality.
I mean, in a sense, of course, I have to come back to what I said in my response, which is that for me, the two questions of what is real about the universe and how, one question, and then how should we as human beings behave to each other, what is the basis of morality, what is the basis for a sense of meaning in our lives, those two questions are just separate questions. I mean, for me, and to my mind, and to my way of thinking, and I think to all humanists, the indifference of the universe causes me no moral problems. The fact that human beings are, not the beneficiaries of some divine plan is just a fact. It's not an existential crisis, as far as I'm concerned. It's just a fact. And maybe that's because I never had any sort of religious faith and I'm not conditioned by it, and nor did my parents and grandparents. And so I don't, I've never lost that faith. I know that a lot of people who have lost a faith can sometimes find themselves rootless because they can think, as John Stuart Mill said, they can think that they've lost the belief. So where now is the foundation for the values that they used to
Good question.
But it's not a question. But it's an explanation. But given that I don't feel like that, I can't see the connection between the two. What are human rights to me? I mean, human rights are something that human beings have invented at a particular time, a time of great crisis. In the Universal Declaration is obviously put together as an expedient mechanism to try and avoid the violence and terror and horror of the Holocaust and of fascism in Europe. And so human beings coming together with the conviction that they want to try and make sure this doesn't happen again because they've witnessed the horror, as the preamble to the Universal Declaration says, witnessing the horror of, it's a very practical declaration, that we want to enshrine certain legal norms to try and prevent people being harmed in the future. And we want to do that because it's better for individuals to live in peaceful societies. We want to be treated well, so we treat others well. We accept that our humanity finds its reflection in other human beings, and to live in stable, peaceful, ordered societies ourselves with justice, we ought to afford that same thing to others. Morality, for me, has its biological foundation in our social instincts, of course, but it's beyond that point a prudential enterprise to live in society well together. It's not because it's written into the universe that I would do those things. I would say that it's a human effort to live well together because we have to.
Okay. I think in the interest of...
He needs to reply to that, surely.
I'm happy to, but I'm also happy to.
I mean, I'm not saying he has to. I mean, he might want to.
Let me do that briefly, and then, because I know there's other questions, but also, hopefully, I don't know about you folks, I always think this is fun when we get some sparks going. That's a couple of things. Let's pick up written into the universe. I think that's a mischaracterization of what I'm saying. When I'm playing with... No, as I was talking about the whole... where I brought you to Aristotle at the end, I think there is the question of telos and purpose, and is there such a thing? And many ethicists, and what's interesting, I very consciously, I think with almost every author I gave you tonight, quite consciously gave you an atheist or a humanist ethicist. So Michael Sandel, for example, is no slouch, and I think his book's quite interesting because he deconstructs Mill, for example. But let me give you another atheist just to respond to that, and then we can perhaps throw it up for the next question. Because that line about, it's only people who perhaps have some religious upbringing. One of the most helpful authors on this, I think, is, for me, certainly is Arthur Leff. So if you haven't read his work, you can Google Leff, L-E-F-F, and then Yale. He was a very influential atheist philosopher in the 1970s, sadly died in his 40s at the height of his powers. He wrote, arguably, in moral philosophy, what is considered one of the seminal essays that if you study moral philosophy at university, you'll probably engage with, Unspeakable Ethics, Unnatural Law. And in that, he basically says all moral claims are authority claims. When somebody says to you, you should do this or don't do that, it's an authority claim. They're taking authority over you. Now, he said, when there is no God, we have to therefore tease it out and ask, where is that authority located? And he said, of course, I'm an atheist, don't believe in God, never have done. It's located in one of two places. We either grant every individual the right to determine good and evil for themselves, And then he said, of course, we have 6 billion godlets running around making up good and evil, and how on earth do we arbitrate between godlet claims? We can't appeal upwards, there is no upward. Remember, we're atheists. Or he says, you arbitrate moral authority to something like the state or the group, and you say, well, the state has the ability to determine good and evil. So it doesn't matter which way you do it, you end up with the same problem. To any authority claim, you can turn around and say, yeah, says who? And he says the whole of ethics, atheist ethics, is shipwrecked on the ground says who problem. And you can dress it up, you can appeal to authority, you can decide you like human rights and bring the state in to wield a big stick behind you, but then you need to admit that's what you're doing. And arguably, his challenge has never been answered. So you can read it online, it's 28 pages, and say Michael Sandel's book, Justice, is a phenomenal discussion of all of these issues, the options like Andrew has played with of utilitarianism and virtue ethics and so forth, and shows you, again, from a humanistic, atheistic perspective, I think the problem that you end up with. And Michael does a wonderful job of showing you the problems, doesn't solve them. You get to the last chapter and you go, I think you missed a chapter. Recommend a look.
If that is a problem, and I don't admit that it necessarily is, but if it is a problem, it is also a problem for you and every other religious person, because you too have chosen, whether of your own free will or otherwise, a religious text and a set of rules and an authority. And you had the power to choose otherwise. And many billions of people do choose otherwise. They choose a different text and a different authority. So even if it is a problem of, seeking some higher authority, it's one that every human being faces ultimately. We all have the ultimate moral responsibility for choosing our authority. And, the problem for me, if it is a problem, is the same as it is for you.
With respect,
Sorry, you don't believe that. You think you have the answer.
This is a fascinating discussion, but we do want to move on to other questions as well.
Sorry.
Let me ask one that perhaps I feel is probably follows on nicely from the discussion so far. So we accept from your discussions, humanism and religion are both self-consistent ways to live. Is there any way to tell whether either is objectively true?
Let's send Andrew's way first.
So why don't you start
I
first?
think that's a very interesting question. I mean, the questioner can't possibly mean that religion to be a single category there, because there are hundreds of religions. Similarly, there are different styles of humanism as well, of course. Although there's a basic similarity between, for example, humanism in India and humanism in Britain, there are differences of emphasis, perhaps, let's say, in that approach to life. I don't think that question that's been asked there is answerable, because every religion, just like every humanism, is a bundle of different claims and beliefs and values. So to try to assess the objective truth of a whole worldview requires a more forensic analysis than just one answer to one question. And also requires analysis, obviously, case-by-case basis, because to look at Catholic Christianity would be different to look at, Baptist faith, and different again from different varieties of Islam or so on and so forth. The objective truth of claims, I think, objective truth can be assessed in relation to particular claims, but not, I think, in particular to not in relation to entire worldviews. They need to be broken down. Is my unhelpful answer, but nonetheless, I think the one I would give.
That was a helpful answer. I think kind of right in what it affirms and wrong potentially in what it denies. I mean, I think you can assess worldviews and you can assess belief systems. You could a number of ways. One of the first things you could do is you can ask, does it stand up, or do you have to smuggle things in from outside? And I think that's where I've been sort of pushing back on atheism slightly this evening, of saying, well, okay, if you say that we are nothing more than physical processes, but on the other hand, you want to have consciousness and freedom and radical existentialist autonomy, as Grayling makes a great case for in his book, to go, I'm not quite sure they fit. And so you can look for internal contradiction. You can also then ask, do the primary claims of the worldview stand up? So, for example, Martin alluded to it in his introduction. Although I'm a Christian writer and philosopher, my academic work was in Islam. So I've spent 25 years studying Islam. I read Quranic Arabic, and I've spent a lot of my time mixing with academics in that field. And I think the two primary claims of Islam, through all strands of Islam, that Muhammad's life was utterly impeccable and unquestionable and the greatest example of a human life that's ever lived. and then secondly, that the Quran has come unmitigated from heaven with no human involvement. We could stack those claims up. My PhD was in computational linguistics, and so I've spent 10 years mucking around with computer algorithms looking at the Quran. I can tell you the Quran didn't fall directly from heaven with no human involvement, and you can see more and more Muslim academics who sort of begrudgingly acknowledge that. So we can put it to the test. Now, what's interesting as we do that, it's very interesting to talk in the abstract, religions and philosophies and worldviews. One of the things that attracted me to the Christian faith, what first drew it to me was that actually Christianity doesn't really fit that category of a religion or a philosophy or belief system quite that well. In fact, the main word that Christians use to describe what we believe is the word gospel. If you're a Christian here this evening, you'll know that word. If you aren't, maybe you've heard Christians use that word. And the English word gospel is the English translation of a Greek word, euangelion, which means good news. And let me read you something very quickly as I just tie up my answer to this question. Professor Tom Wright, now at St Andrews University, so he's one of ours across the border in Scotland, one of the world's most renowned historians and theologians, unpacks this. He writes, many people today assume that Christianity is a religion, a moral system, a philosophy. In other words, they assume that Christianity is about advice. It wasn't, and it isn't. Christianity is simply good news. It is the news that something has happened in history as a result of which the world is a different place. You can debate the merits of a religion or a moral system or a philosophy, but a news event is discussed in a different way. Either the event happened or it didn't, and if it did happen, either it means what people say it means or it doesn't. And 20 years ago, this April, I proposed to my wife, and she said yes. If I'd come and told some of my friends in the sort of philosophy department at Oxford University, hey, guess what? I've asked my wife, my girlfriend, the most beautiful woman in the world, to marry me, and she said yes, and there's no alcohol involved. If one of my friends had sort of looked at me and gone, that's a fascinating philosophical claim, Andy. Let's test that using modal logic and Wittgenstein and Aristotle's ethics. And then we can answer whether it's rational for you to describe yourself as engaged. I think my friend would have missed something. That my announcement wasn't a philosophy, it was a piece of news. And in which case, only two things is true. Did it happen, and does it mean what you think it does? And I think that's the category I'd encourage you tonight, if you're a skeptic or an outsider or a seeker, to look at Jesus and the Christian faith through the prism of news, not through the prism of philosophy.
I mean, that's a very interesting prism through which to look at it. And of course, I'm not quite sure what point you're making with that, but certainly if you do look at it that way, then you can see that Christianity is just as historically contingent and messy and open to interpretation as any other religious claim. For a start, the more Gospels that we dig up, the more varieties of stories that we discover.
No, we don't, and we can push back on that.
Well, we do.
History.
I mean, we both have this background, but you can. I mean, we've both read the Synoptic Gospels, so there's probably nowhere to go beyond that. But you find differences in treatment, you find differences in story, you find groups of people and committees that have to get together to decide what story should be followed and what text should be canonical.
With respect, Andrew, if we want to do a historical debate, we can do, but I'm not going to let you get away
well, I don't know what point
with
you're
low-grade historical
I don't know what point you're making
skepticism.
I thought you were making a point about that Christianity is somehow not as historically contingent as other things.
Well, actually, it isn't, interesting enough. I mean, take Islam, for example. Here's an interesting...
it's not as much as that.
Well, the point I was going to make for you is this, which is interesting, is you could actually... what's fascinating is you could remove the founder of any other religion from history and it could still stand. That's often pointed out by anthropologists. If Buddha had never been born, you could have started Buddhism and it could still look the same, because it's basically a system of thought, and fat little statues of you would be adorning mantelpieces across Asia.
Charming.
If Muhammad had never been born, Islam could have come with someone else, and my Muslim friends are very clear on this point, that Muhammad was just the person through whom it came. Whatever you make of it, the interesting thing about the Christian faith is the Christian faith is not a set of morals brought by Jesus or a philosophical system taught by him, but is his life and his personality. And sure, you can dismiss that, you can walk away, you can throw dust at it and try and refuse to look at it, but there is a uniqueness there that I could start quoting you atheist historians if we want to.
Well, you like to do that, I realise. I mean, just to be clear, I'm not here to defend your interpretation of every atheist who ever lived. I mean, I don't think that's an obligation on me. The things that I've said are the things that I want to defend. I think you're wrong, though. I don't think that in any sense the story of the life of Jesus is unique. It fits very neatly into I think parable traditions from folk cultures all over the world. I mean, I don't think. Well, I think that there are, for example, that spider in the Caribbean, in Nancy. That's a good example.
That what? Sorry.
There's a spider called a Nancy in the Caribbean.
Right. So let me get this right. So we're going historically from first century Greco-Roman culture, leaping across to the other side of the.
I'm giving examples of certain tropes that are common in human culture.
Really?
One of them being a moral. I don't know if I've touched a nerve or something, but...
Not at all.
Okay, fine.
It's fascinating to find kind of sort of 1960s scepticism that we thought was actually dead in the academy, being revivified like a zombie. But this is fascinating.
One of them perhaps, I think we're kind of... perhaps it's kind of... we need to get quite technical to get to the bottom of this. But let's
Richard Balcom, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses.
I'll invite you back for another debate on that point. But let's move on. And the next question is, how does what you believe about the nature of human existence after death affect your understanding of the significance of life? I think we should start with you this time, Andy Bannister.
Gosh, there's a question. Can you rephrase that for me? Sorry, I didn't
let me repeat the question. How does what you believe about the nature of human existence after death affect your understanding of the significance of life?
It's good. It's a very good question, and I think it works. I think you can explore this in two ways in terms of after death. You can explore it both in terms of is there any kind of afterlife in terms of a heaven or some kind. You can also explore it in terms of judgment. And actually, I'm going to take the more unusual route and take the first one because I've just done an event on this at the University of Liverpool last week. And I think one of the things I find interesting is that when you talk to people about religion, one of the words that people are often very negative about is the whole idea of judgment. It represents, what's very bad about religion for most people. The idea that it's after death. There's a God who's going to sort of judge us and hold us to account. Wouldn't it be nice instead if there was nothing, or if it was all kind of rainbows and kittens and sitting on a cloud forever? And I pointed out to my atheist audience at the University of Liverpool, it's interesting, actually. I said everybody, and I put it to you, actually, everybody in this room, wherever you come from, actually wants some kind of judgment after the end of life. Let me help you see why. By quoting to you from a Yugoslavian writer called Miroslav Volf. Because what he says on this is very, very interesting. He says, I used to think that judgment and wrath was unworthy of God. Isn't God love? Shouldn't divine love be beyond wrath and judgment? God is love, surely, and God loves every person and every creature. But that's exactly why God is wrathful against some of them. My last resistance to the idea of God's wrath and judgment was a casualty of the war in the former Yugoslavia, the region from which I come. According to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed, over 3 million were displaced. My villages and cities were destroyed, my people shelled day in, day out, some of them brutalized beyond imagination, and I cannot imagine God not being angry. Or think of Rwanda in the last decade of the past century, where 800,000 people were hacked to death in 100 days. How did God react to that carnage? Did he dote on the perpetrators in a grandfatherly fashion? Did he refuse to condemn the bloodbath but just affirm the perpetrators' basic goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath and judgment, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who was not wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God is not wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful and a God of judgment because God is love. And he goes on in the essay to talk about the problem that if there is no judgment beyond the grave, if this life is all that there is, and you live in a war zone, you live in Rwanda, you live in Aleppo, you live in the former Yugoslavia, and someone bombs your village, someone rapes your sister, someone kills your brother, what are you going to do? Sit around and wait for the UN to sort it out? Hope that somebody might start a hashtag sort of move on Twitter and sort of make the perpetrators feel bad about themselves? No, what you're going to do is you're going to take violence into your own hands. You burnt my village, I'm going to burn your village. You raped my sister, we'll rape yours. You killed my brother, I'll kill yours. And the spiral of violence goes round and round and round. And we see that in many, many parts of the world. The only thing that breaks that cycle, says Volf in that essay, is if you actually believe that beyond this life there is judgment. And those who have escaped justice, apparently now, will face it then. And Joseph Stalin, who killed, by some estimates, 200 million people, got away scot-free. Last act on his deathbed was to shake his fist at heaven. Well, if atheism is true, so what? On the other hand, the Christian story of reality, that this life is not all there is, there will be an accounting, there will be an accountability, that begins to give a framework to some of those war-torn areas of the world now that let us actually begin to talk meaningfully about reconciliation. And it's interesting when you look at somewhere like the former South Africa, where after the apartheid era, it was a specifically Christian model of justice and forgiveness that was appealed to begin to try and put some of those things back together. So yes, I think what you believe about afterlife has huge implications now. And if it doesn't, you're not thinking seriously enough.
So obviously there are a great number of examples of human beings and communities taking into their own hands the question of justice and responding to violence, not within the next endless cycle of violence, but through an effort of will to try and put it right, to try and stop that violence, to try and break that cycle. And they certainly don't need to have any particular religion or belief to do so. There are many humanists who've taken part of that endeavour. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we were talking about earlier is an example of that. The end of the English civil wars is an example of that. The great play by Aeschylus, recommend Aeschylus's Oresteia, the final play of which in the trilogy is all about bringing a halt to violence and to vengeance and to the cycle of violence through human justice and the willful creation of courts and systems of law that will, on the basis of community authority, seek to prevent those sorts of atrocities again in the future. So that's something to be said there. In terms of the original question, what you think about life and death, and particularly life after death, I think does affect your attitude to how you live. And certainly from my point of view, the knowledge that this life here and now is not just a small part of our eternal life, but the entirety of our life, I think does affect the way that I live. I mean, I know, for example, that my own, if I'm ever to move towards completeness or some sort of personal completeness, that can only take place in this life. There'll be no other world in which that can happen. And so in terms of my own personal development and also how I want to treat other people, I think, and what sort of world I want to make for them, I think the fact that I think it is our only world and there is no other world or life to come means that I want to make it better, because it is the only one that I have and the only one that they have. I also think that the knowledge that justice won't come hereafter, and that if we want to have some sort of justice, some sort of improvement in people's conditions, some sort of salvation for people who experience great tragedy, again, the lack of it in any future post-mortem state, I think can be a powerful spur, an urgent injunction, actually, to try and make it in this world. So that certainly affects me in those ways.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question. Hold on. I've lost my place here.
It's that red button.
That red button, yeah. This is for Andy Bannister. Mm-hmm. Why do you suppose that a human life has more meaning than a chimpanzee or a mouse or any other life form?
Sure, that's, in one sense, I think, I'm tempted to say it's not a question for me. I think it's a question for Andrew at that end of the table, but I can certainly make a couple of reflections on it. I mean, I think if there is no God and we live in a universe that is purely governed by the forces of chemistry and physics and biology, then all of us are the result of time plus chance plus natural selection, and that equally goes for the mouse as well as for the monkey as well as for myself. And to go, you look at someone like Peter Singer, very well-regarded atheist ethicist. I mean, he's actually coined the term speciesism to talk about this idea that we talk about human exceptionalism, that actually we shouldn't be doing that. And I think that would be, I'll let Andrew kind of speak to that in a moment. Here's the interesting thing, though. What I find fascinating is that human exceptionalism pops up everywhere. So if you try and take a consistent sort of Peter Singer position and go, right, I am going to live as if every form of life on the planet has exactly the same value. In fact, you could even push it further, as I think it was David Attenborough recently did, and actually said that human beings are rather like a virus, actually. It might be good for the rest of creation if we were not here. Well, let's just take an equalizing platform and go, well, the problem is now we don't act that way, any single one of us. Case in point, the fox breaks into the chicken coop and kills the chickens. We do not put the fox on trial. I break into my neighbour's chicken coop and I proceed to massacre the chickens and throw bits and blood and gore everywhere, and you bring me up on animal rights infractions, and quite rightly, in that human beings seem to have a moral responsibility to the animal world that the animal world does not have to us, and we recognise that everywhere. Now, there's a couple of interesting things going on there. One is I think it shows, this is a whole other discussion, but I think it shows, and I'll offend somebody, but I like offending people sometimes just to get the audience going. It shows why I think some of the way that rights-based language is going is profoundly unhelpful. We started with human rights, we proceeded into animal rights, and now actually there's talk about granting rights to things like national parks and rainforests, which becomes increasingly problematic. I prefer to take the old Greek approach to this and say, actually, as the early Greek ethicists said, people like Plato, let's talk about responsibility. And as human beings, we have a responsibility to the natural world. We have a responsibility to the animal kingdom. Of course, that begs the question still, where does that responsibility come from? So I'd be interested to hear Andrew's perspective on this from a humanist perspective, especially responding to the speciesism charge, that is humanism not inherently discriminatory? But I think every single one of us here are human exceptionalists. And if you deny that, I challenge you to try living that way.
So, Andrew, does human life have more meaning than chimpanzee and mouse?
I think the question was a question more for Andy. I don't think it raised any problems for me, but I would like to follow on from the question that Andy did raise at the end of his point. I mean, Peter Singer, as you correctly say, is a distinctively humanist ethical philosopher, actually, as well, coming from that humanistic utilitarian approach to ethics. And I think that it has been a significant feature of humanist thought, especially since Jeremy Bentham, let's say, to say that yes, we are moral agents and we make our conscious choices, but there are two parties to an act, and an animal doesn't have to be capable of being a moral agent to deserve some sort of protection or some sort of sympathy. And he famously put it as, the question is not can it reason, but can it suffer? And I think that one of the consequences of the consequentialist approach to ethics, especially in the recent humanist tradition, has been the expansion of our moral sympathies beyond just ourselves to other animals, especially those that we can most closely affiliate with, that we recognise, for example, as being relatively close to us on the spectrum of suffering. Because I think although I agree with you, almost every human being is a human exceptionalist. Not everyone, actually, but because some people really are sort of deep green, Gaia is a goddess and we are a plague on the earth type sort of people, not many people. I would agree that I also would be a human exceptionalist, but I think I would position human beings on one far end of what is nonetheless a spectrum. Yeah. So I think, everyone used to think that human beings were particularly unique because we made machines. And now we know that blackbirds use levers to open, this, that, and the other. Everyone thought that human beings were unique because we planned ahead and predicted our actions and could replicate them. And now we know that squid catch tennis balls in cups and know where they've left it before, and all that sort of thing. So I think increasingly the more we learn about other animals other than ourselves, and especially those that are quite close to us on these spectra of behaviour, the more they seem deserving of our moral consideration.
Let me just come back quickly on that next. You batted it nicely back my way. I'm glad you acknowledged your human exceptionalist, because if you weren't, I would move slightly more down this end of the room just to be on the safe side. Because I saw Andrew demolish a 16-ounce steak at dinner, and so that man has teeth. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think interesting to ask ourselves the question. And I often use this exercise on university audiences when I'm talking about this. Interesting to ask ourselves what we think we're doing when we talk about human rights. And a really helpful illustration. I wish I could remember who I first stole this from. It's not original to me. I can't remember who it came from, so I will happily take the credit. And it goes like this. If I had a big whiteboard here, we draw a circle on it, and we'd say that circle represents the genome of every living thing on planet Earth. It's the whole of genomic space. Everything that has DNA is inside that circle. And when we talk about human rights and human exceptionalism, humanism, whatever words we use, what are we doing? Well, we're coming along, we're drawing a slightly smaller circle and saying if you live inside this smaller circle, you have a special set of rights and dignity, responsibility, whatever kind of labels we want to put on it. We have responsibility not to cause suffering, as Peter Singer would say, if you live in that smaller circle. So what's the problem? Well, number one, it's arbitrary. Number two, problem is along comes the white supremacist, draws a slightly smaller circle and says, yeah, now if you live in my smaller circle, you have a set of rights. If you live outside it, you don't. The problem is both circles are arbitrary. And as the very well-regarded American atheist neuroscientist Sam Harris put it beautifully, he said, here's the problem we seem to have. If we draw the circles too narrow, we start excluding people. We exclude the disabled. We exclude the very old. We exclude people with Downs syndrome. Our friend Professor Dawkins got himself in trouble on that one a year or so ago. Draw the circle too wide, and we start sucking in all kinds of strange members of the animal kingdom and saying cucumbers, have the right to free assembly or something. And Sam, I respect him. He has the honesty to say it's a real conundrum as to where we draw it. And so it's interesting that we agree on the human exceptionalism. I think it raises all kinds of quite complex metaphysical questions that I think tell us all kinds of wonderful things about who we really are and our telos and our purpose and who we were made to be. But that's because I'm a theist and he's a humanist. We have to argue about something.
Do we?
Okay.
Next question.
On that nice sort of concordant note, I would like to just take some live questions at this point. So if you would like to ask a question, are the mics sort of set up? Roving mics are good? Are we good to go? Excellent. So if you would like to ask a question, please put up your hand and wait for the stewards to pass the mic to you before asking your question. To make it easier for the speakers to answer your question, please keep your questions clear, courteous, and to the point, okay? So we're running out of time, so please keep them to the point. So anybody would like... Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay, go for it.
And one other request, could you begin with your name? Because it's always really nice to know as speakers who we're addressing.
My name's Anne Dannerall, and I just wanted to ask Andrew Copson. So I am a Christian, I'm a church minister, and in my life I spend so much time with people who are strangers, with the homeless, with women who've been abused, those who've suffered domestic violence. They're strangers, they're not people I know, but because of my faith, that leads me to want to reach out and to touch them, and that's part of my personal happiness. But everything that you talked about seems to be about a personal happiness that's just for you. And yes, there's connections, and I get that bit, but where would you have a connection with someone who was a complete stranger and who might be abusive to you and actually not give you any pleasure whatsoever? And yet within our Christian ethos and our kind of faith belief in a God who loves everyone and who gives dignity to every single person, then we are able to do that.
I think that's certainly not unique to Christianity, and I think we're luckily almost all the great ethical traditions of the world place a certain emphasis, especially on concern for the stranger, of course. And I have absolutely no problem. In fact, it comes naturally to me to respond to the humanity of another person, and non-religious people who volunteer in their communities, who do that sort of caring, loving work, are responding to that same need, that same impulse in themselves that I think you're responding to. And I think all human beings that reach out to others and want to care for them are responding to that same impulse. And we differ, no doubt, in the interpretation we give to our actions, how we explain them to ourselves, and the gloss that we put on them. But I think they are a vital ingredient of a good life and a vital ingredient of a meaningful life. And when I talked about relationships with others, I didn't just mean, as it were, our family and friends. I meant relations with all the human beings that we encounter.
Can I chip in quickly on
okay,
that?
yep,
But I don't think Christians are exceptional in this.
Yeah. I think what I'd say, I want to sort of affirm some of what Andrew said, but also sort of push back slightly and say I think we need to be very clear that our human. Obviously, I'm a Christian, so as Christians, be very firm that our humanist friends, our atheist friends, can do incredible works of good. And sometimes Christians can be heard to be saying that's not the case, and I think that's profoundly unhelpful and unfair. But that's not the question. The question isn't can you do good deeds. The question, I think, is the more interesting: does good actually exist? So it's interesting that earlier on, a couple of times, Andrew alluded to the idea that. In a godless world, everything is explained by time plus chance plus natural selection. I think you alluded to the idea that morality kind of develops and evolves. And what's interesting, if you look at the work that's been done in evolutionary ethics by people like E.O. Wilson and others, it's pretty much taken as a given that altruism doesn't exist. It looks like altruism, but it's just group selection effect. I'm generous to people who either bear or might bear the same DNA as me, or I'm generous to somebody because they might scratch my back. And there's a wonderful book by an atheist, because I like to recommend atheist people who say useful things. David Stove, dead now, sadly, a wonderful iconoclastic Australian philosopher, died a few years ago, wrote a wonderful book called Darwinian Fairy Tales, which is a hilarious deconstruction of the idea that we can get ethics and altruism out of evolution. It is a rip-roaring read, and this is one of his points, is that it destroys altruism entirely. I mentioned at the start of my talk that here we are in Hull, birthplace William Wilberforce. One of the best biographies of Wilberforce was written by William Hague. Whatever your political leanings, Hague is a brilliant political biographer. Fascinating. In his biography of Wilberforce, he made an interesting comment that really struck me. He said, Wilberforce and the other abolitionists did such a phenomenal job that those of us living on the other side of abolition just sort of take it as a given that it's obvious that slavery is wrong. But he went, we forget that every civilization enslaved people. Greeks, Romans, the Persians, of course the Brits did it, the Africans did it, where I used to live in Canada, the First Nations did it to each other, everybody. We now assume that it's wrong because they did their work so spectacularly, but they always did it so well, we forget where the worldview was that fed into that idea. It didn't arise in a vacuum, and you can't understand it without understanding the Christian faith that animated them so powerfully in terms of their belief of what it was about a human being and why slavery was wrong. So I do think worldview does matter. Of course you can do good, incredible good as a humanist, but does good actually exist if there is no God? That's, I think, the deeper question.
I think worldview matters a lot less than that implies. I mean, I think, take a good, we're all about quoting atheists today, so I suppose I'll do the same. Take the humanist novelist George Eliot, which most people have heard of, and she was a Christian, and she then turned away from Christianity and talked about humanism. And her reason for doing so was precisely the opposite of what you've just said. She felt that the moralizing of Christianity, the saying, I do this for the stranger because I believe I ought to do it and this is my principle. She said, love does not say I ought to love, it loves. Pity does not say, I ought to pity, it pities. Justice does not say, I am bound to be just, it feels justly. So you could equally make the opposite case and say that we're all just doing that as human beings all the time, depending on, our own personal inheritance and our environment. And just as in certain times, in certain places, Christianity might inspire anti-slavery movements, it might also inspire pro-slavery movements, as it did at the time in the Christians that opposed Wilberforce. And just as at the time of Aristotle, there were anti-slave movements in Greece that were obviously not inspired by Christianity because it didn't exist. So, I think it's a very small picture to take a religion which, after all, hasn't even yet lasted as long as the worship of the goddess Isis did, and say that somehow it's responsible for all, the good things that have come back. Now, of course, people who have a particular religious commitment make sense of their actions and their values through that, and reflecting on it, just as we all reflect on our commitments, will change the way we act. In your situation, it will drive you, or you will believe it as driving you towards helping others. Some people it will drive. I'm sure you're shaking your head, so I haven't understood what you were saying. Sorry. I thought that you were saying that your own Christian faith impelled you towards these actions and gave you the resources to reach out to others as strangers. If you weren't saying that, I apologise. But if that is what you were saying, I would merely say that there are many resources that do that, and this is not unique. And we all make sense of our actions in that way, whatever our worldview might be.
No, I appreciate what you're saying, but I wouldn't want you to assume you know why I do what I do, and that I do it because I ought to, or because I should, or because I'm impelled to.
I thought that's what you were saying. I apologise if that's not the case.
It's a love that comes from within that I believe comes from God, and that I certainly didn't feel before that, because I didn't come from a religious family. I only found faith at 19, and it has changed my world and made a significant difference to me, and I suppose nobody can take that away from me or say why I feel the way I feel. But I appreciate we have two different views here, and I respect both of you for those.
I was going to say that's just to finish up. I think that's profoundly helpful, and I think it's interesting. Just as you made your last comment, Andrew, it's interesting. The words banging in my ears were one of the most well-regarded European philosophers, Jürgen Habermas, who just, I think, kind of cut through a little bit of the postmodern fluff we're hearing occasionally from the other end of the table. He said, universalistic egalitarianism...
He's a lot less rude than you.
Yeah, he's German, so I mean...
That's a value that you...
So the fact I've got a German atheist philosopher here for you is particularly impressive. He said, universalistic egalitarianism, from which sprang the ideals of freedom and a collective life in solidarity, the autonomous conduct of life and emancipation. Gosh, you can write long paragraphs. The individual morality of conscience, human rights and democracy is the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there is no alternative to that foundation. And in light of the current challenges of a post-national constellation, we continue to draw on the substance of this heritage. Everything else, I love this bit, everything else is just idle, postmodern talk. And with respect to George Eliot, what the tragedy is, and why I like the way you framed it, is that I think where Christianity is often miscaricatured and Christians often go wrong, as we do, we need to own up to that, is when Christianity and moralism get collapsed together. And I can understand why George Eliot would want to run from that. Jesus spent most of his time attacking the Pharisees for their dry, dead moralism. The Christian approach to ethics is one of love, because of what the love that Christ has first shown me and shown you. That's why I love others, because somebody gave their life for me and gave everything. Then I have a response to do the same. And Christian ethics lived properly should be a response. It's not always, and it becomes dead letter and dead legalism. And if anyone here has experienced that, I can even but apologise. That is not what the Christian faith was ever intended to be.
Okay, can we take the next question, please? So, gentleman with the red jumper.
To see, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Oh, there we are.
Hi, my name's John Gowans, by the way. So my question is to Andrew Copson. So I think in the same way that Andy set out his argument that there are dangers associated with life having a meaning without God, I just wondered if you believe there are dangers associated with life only having a meaning because of God.
Yes, I think so. I mean, one of the unfortunate consequences in all religions, for the last 2,500 years, especially those though that rely on the idea that there is one answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything, and some ultimate authority and reality behind it all. One of the constant problems for those sorts of religions is that they can give rise to convictions, certainties, lacks of doubt that then cause people to impose their own views on others, to persecute them, to try and make them fit, to grind them down into some sort of single mass, as John Stuart Mill pointed out in the quote I gave earlier. And I think that's always a possibility. especially with monotheistic, the Middle Eastern monotheistic religions that we've been discussing of Judaism, Christianity, Islam. That's always a possibility, I think, with those religions, in a way that it isn't with, for example, religions that don't make big claims about an ultimate meaning to the universe, like, for example, most forms of Hinduism, or other worldviews like humanism, which are not religious but say things about morality and meaning. I think those fall less frequently into that trap. So I think that's a trap. So if you're so certain, and this is not, like I say, this is something that just those religions can sometimes cause. It's not that every single adherent or believer in them is going around all the time with this certainty. I think that Peter Ustinov, who was a much-loved vice president of the BHA for many years, Peter Ustinov said, it's certainty that divides people and doubt unites us. And I think that certainty is the downside of these totalizing beliefs about single meaning.
Can I just say, quick response? Yeah. Let me say a couple of things. I could cheekily go, are you certain of that?
No, I'm not.
And I say that actually, I actually
No.
say that, interestingly, I say that only semi-cheekily to go, it's very interesting.
No, I'm not certain of it.
That I think we live in an age where I think it's important to have some of these big ideas and meta-narratives that have sort of controlled us deconstructed. I think that religion can do great harm when it becomes a sort of all-controlling narrative that tries to play the political game. As somebody once remarked, when the church gets into bed with the state, the church becomes the state's whore. Things go desperately wrong. Atheism has gone desperately wrong in parts of the world. That's not to say it applies to every atheist, but it has gone. And what is one of the things in common is that totalizing idea. So we need a little bit of deconstruction. The problem we now have is when you start deconstructing some of these big narratives, all the attempts to deconstruct end up deconstructing themselves. What do I mean? Well, along came Friedrich Nietzsche, and he says all truth claims are power claims. Problem is, Friedrich, that's a truth claim. So therefore, we can't believe you, because it's just power. Right? Along comes Freud. Well, every claim to truth, every claim to authority is just repressed sexuality. Well, presumably then, Sigmund, including what you've just said, zip, and off goes the branch he's sitting on. Along comes the humanist and tries to critique religion and says, religion is based on faith, and over here perhaps we have evidence, as Richard Dawkins has done. Of course, as many philosophers of science have pointed out, science is based upon faith as much as religion, actually, if you study the history of philosophy, and zip, again, the chainsaw sits off what you're sitting on. We need something that can deconstruct narratives, but can also deconstruct ourselves at the same time without soaring off the branch that we're sitting on. And one reason we need to do that is, as human beings, we are always very inclined, all of us, to divide the world into them and us. Religions do this very, very well. I readily admit that. So does humanism. It's very easy as a humanist or as an atheist to look down on others, especially those religious rednecks, and go, well, I'm glad I'm, scientific and superior and enlightened and, have A.C. Grayling on my shelf. I'm glad I don't have Joel Osteen and goodness knows what else. If you're a Buddhist, it's very easy to look down on others who are not as enlightened as you. I have a friend in Toronto who's a Buddhist monk. I'm very proud of the fact he's almost attained Buddha consciousness, and somewhat snooty about those who haven't. If you are within the Hindu worldview, tremendous damage done by the idea of karma, that you can look down on those who are not as up the karmic chain as you are. And of course, in Islam, which is all about the acquirement of merit through good works, very easy to look down on those who are not the same as you, whose acquirement of good merit is not the same. This is why I find the Christian faith so compelling, because taken seriously, it does not allow you to look down on others. It deconstructs you as much as it deconstructs others. Because I look at Andrew and I go, he's a fallen human being who's messed up and broken and needs the love of Christ. But then so am I. I have no ground for superiority. Even if I think I'm right, I have no ground for dinging someone else around the head, because I know what I'm really like. And the sign that somebody who claims to be a Christian really is there should be a terrific humility in engaging with others, because it's not about us. I'm not a Christian because I think I'm clever enough or wise enough or smart enough or learned enough. I'm a Christian, and I follow Jesus failingly and desperately because I know what I'm like on the inside, behind the public persona, and I know how much I need that love and that grace and that forgiveness. It's all about him, and it's not about me. And I know nothing else that cuts against this trend of superiority we all have, other than the grace narrative built into Christianity.
Could we have a question for...
I'm sure you're a better person than you think. I'm sure you're not that bad.
I always say, if you think you're a good person, you know the great cure to that? Get married. My wife reminds me on a daily basis.
Could I have just one last question? This one for Andy Bannister.
Oh, okay.
Any question for Andy Bannister? Okay, there's a gentleman with the great...
It's why the joke's so bad, there is no answer. What's your name, sir?
It's me, Nikki. My name's Nikki.
So I can't see where you are, actually. Oh, there you are. Okay, I'm sorry. What's your name?
Nikki.
Nikki.
Actually, it's a question to both of you, if that's okay.
Okay.
That's right, yep.
Far away.
I've come tonight, I don't actually have any religious beliefs, but I've sat and listened to both of you.
Yeah.
And my thinking on my feeling about life is because I don't have any religious beliefs. I believe that if we live with empathy, compassion, to think about other people, to be there to help other people, I think that's important for everything, to make the world go round, for religion and not for religion. And where does it say in the Bible, because it's something I've never read, and I will be completely honest.
Okay.
Where does it say that the human being is the most superior race to any other living being on the planet? Every life is a life. When it's alive, it's a life until it dies. And I'm a big believer in looking after the planet and the animals. And I do believe that the human race is the main cause of the problems on this planet. I don't know your views on that. And it's just something I wanted to put to both of you. And if there is a God...
There's many questions there.
There's lots of questions sort of tied up.
Perhaps we'll just we'll pause there, because I think that's probably enough to fill the rest of the airtime.
Here's a thought.
So,
Martin's suggestion, why don't we, because the idea about the first part of it was a really good summary of humanism, so why don't you respond, because I thought there's lots in there you'll be nodding at, and then the particular biblical question I'll answer.
Are you happy with that, or do you feel is...
Or I can do the whole thing, but the first part seemed to be a sort of...
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it illustrates very well the basis of the perennial morality that human communities and individuals seem to alight upon. I mean, if you think about something like the Golden Rule, to treat other people in the way that you would like to be treated yourself in their situation, I mean, this is a sort of timeless principle, which for any human community that we have written records of their ethical thinking from, 3,000 years, for the last 3,000 years, before any of the current active world religions came on the scene, really, apart from one or two, then, this is a simple rule for ethical living that has been worked out from social necessity. And I think that what we've learned, I can't see.
Sorry, ISIS believes that too, that they're doing good.
Yes, well, that's right, and then you have to make a judgment about what. Well, I don't think they think that. Well, that's slight. I mean, that's okay. So that's a slight interruption. Obviously, as was said earlier, different people. Like the neo-Nazi example that Andy gave, different people will set the boundaries of humanity at different cut-off points. And one of the problems that we have to face, and we still haven't faced yet as a species that is increasingly aware of its global interconnectedness, one of the problems we have to face is to, demonstrate to ourselves the necessity of thinking about every human being in that ethical calculation, and not just my village, my tribe, my people, my faith, my country, or whatever. That's a real ethical dilemma. But that principle for living has been alighted on by human communities across the world. If you were theistically inclined, you might say that's because it's written into the nature of reality. If you're humanistically inclined, you'll say, well, that's evidence that our morality is not something that comes from outside. It's not something that needs external sanction. It's not something that's a gift from elsewhere else. But that simple compassion for other people is something that has its basis in our biology. As Darwin observed, when you see two primates cooperating, you don't go, where is the chimp god that gave them rules for living? You observe this behaviour as something natural. and not the basis of our morality is natural, not the be-all and end-all of it, but the foundation of our morality is natural. And I think that explains the similarity between ethical systems across the world. The work doesn't end there. The hard cultural work of systems of law and systems of ethics and trying to give a global dimension to those things is very hard work. But I agree with you. At root, it's very simple. Morality is very simple. And most people can live, all things being equal, with very simple ethical precepts that they hardly think about, of being good to others because they don't think of doing anything other than that, because it's what they recognise is a pleasure for themselves and will be there so for other people. Now, when it comes to the rest of the world, of course, there's no doubt that we are the first species that have it in our power to destroy the whole lot. Just a few well-placed devices, or badly placed devices, let me make it clear, badly placed devices would blow up the whole Earth. And that, again, is something that we have to struggle with. Will we find the ethical tools to deal with that supremacy that we now enjoy or suffer over the rest of the world? Well, time will tell. I think that we have it in us to achieve that, but I worry that perhaps we won't.
Okay, great. Lots in there. Let me say a few things. Partly I'm responding to Andrew and my kind of sort of close, but also to your question. I think there's a lot of confusion around ethics, and I think this is why this conversation sort of wandered all over the kind of map this evening. I mean, one confusion, for example, is the maxim, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, the golden rule, is actually not common to most religions. So there's most ethical systems and philosophical systems have something called the silver rule. And if you know your moral philosophy, the silver rule is don't do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. So I'm not going to go across and punch Martin in the face, because I don't want him to punch me in the face. And he's a physicist. He's probably got access to weaponry.
No, that's what you do.
That's absolutely not true. So let me just
the
golden rule goes a lot further. And actually says, no, it's more than that. It's actually do to him as I would have him do to me. So it's proactive. And you see the silver rule that's found in most belief systems is actually a very thin ethic. It gives me no responsibility to do anything to anybody, as long as I don't do any harm. But actually the golden rule, as Jesus taught it, goes much further. In fact, Jesus didn't even notch it up a tad. Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Which, quite frankly, is insane. I mean, I should love my friend, love my enemies. What are you talking about? But, of course, Jesus was uniquely gifted to be able to say that because, of course, his whole life was about loving his enemies. We, the human race, nailed him to 2 bits of wood, and as he hung there, he said, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And on that basis has the ability to look at us and say, I've forgiven my enemies, because you were my enemy and I've forgiven you. Now go do likewise. Utilitarianism, which is another idea that we've played with throughout this evening. Let's just talk about that for a moment. I mean, that's a bit of a dead duck because, of course, as was pointed out to John, I think it was John Stuart Mill himself pointed out the basic problem with utilitarianism, which is something that Andrew has kind of flirted with this evening, is, of course, it leads you to the conclusion that actually, ultimately, there's all kinds of strange things that flow off that. If we could justify killing 3 people in the front row painlessly in order to heal 10 people over here, the utilitarian calculus wouldn't necessarily prevent us doing that. We actually need an ethical system, we need a moral framework that actually assigns value and dignity to each person, which is what I've been talking about this evening. Which brings you back to your question about what does the Bible say on this. And I'd say a couple of things. First, the Bible says that human beings are uniquely gifted in that we are made in the image of God, and thus bear responsibility. So yes, you have responsibility to the natural world. And I agree, human beings are doing tremendous damage. If atheism is true, so what? Next meteor comes around the corner and we go the same way as the dinosaurs. The next virulent plague wipes us out, so what? It's just nature red in tooth and claw. And at the end of the day, some species get the breaks and some don't. If Christian faith is true, you have an impetus not just to be generous and kind to your fellow human beings because they are image bearers, but also to creation because it's God's good gift to you. And one of the unique things in Christian thought, it allows you to look at the world around you and not merely go, this happens to be where we've randomly turned up. This is where the primordial soup first got going. But this is a gift. And just as I don't take a gift that if my wife buys me a beautiful present for Christmas, I don't, break it, spit on it, wheel over it. I treat it with care because of the person who gave it to me. There's a tremendous impetus, I think, in the Christian faith to treat the world in that same way. But then lastly, and I'll end here on your question. You know, built into the ultimate reality of things and the Christian view of things is a profound answer to what the ultimate reality is. On atheism, the ultimate reality is just the dancing of atoms. That ultimately, at the bedrock of reality, that's all we have. Christian faith says, no, that's not the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality, the ultimate ethic baked into reality by the baker, thank you for that, Jake, is love. That's the supreme ethic. And everything flows from that. And of course, that raises the question, well, what is love? How do we define it? Well, it's interesting. Jesus was once asked what the greatest form of love is. And he gave an answer that probably many of us here would recognize instinctively. The greatest form of love is to give your life for another. That's the highest form of love. I have a 4-year-old daughter. She was playing in the streets outside my house, and I saw one of the rubbish trucks, the dust trucks that operate in our community. I'm still relearning British English after 6 years in Canada, reversing up the street. And I saw what was going to happen, and I run out of the door, take my daughter Katrina, throw her out of the way of the truck, out of the lorry, and get squished in the process. What would you conclude? That I loved my daughter so much that I thought nothing of laying down my life for her. Well, here's an interesting thought for those of you who are beginning to think about the Christian faith this evening. If God does exist, and if God is the greatest possible being, then anything God does must be the greatest by definition. And therefore, if God is a God of love, his love must be the greatest form of love. Well, it's interesting. People often think that all the different world religions talk about a God of love. That's actually not true. A few of them do. Islam in the Quran, I think, uses the word love to describe God about 3 times, I believe. Well, of course, if God simply sits up there in heaven and does nothing, how on earth is that a form of love? How on earth is that the greatest form of love? But in the Christian faith, God steps into history, demonstrates the value of you and me and Andrew and everyone here, whether you're a skeptic or a disciple of Jesus, by going to the cross. But then, in Jesus, the greatest form of love is demonstrated because God gives his life for you and for me. The greatest act of love by the greatest possible being, imbuing human life with a tremendous value and dignity, motivating and empowering, as I would say in the Christian faith, to go and make a difference, not just to each other, but to creation, God's good gift to you and to me. Brilliant question. Thank you for asking it.
Okay, in view of time, I think... sad to say we have to wrap up this Q&A session. Fascinating answers and questions as well. I'm sure we could carry on for a long, long time more, but we do have to bring this to an end. So to wrap up the Q&A session, indeed the whole debate, I will ask the last question, and it is this: why does tonight's question matter? So Andrew, would you like to start, and then over to Andrew? Okay.
Is this something we're meant to have prepared? I didn't realise that.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
Well, good question. I think it does matter. I don't think the question, that's difficult for me to answer because fundamentally, of course, I don't think that God is on the cards. I don't think that that's an aspect of the universe. I don't think it's not something that I've ever considered in my experience, and I can't see that even if it did exist, we would be able to know sufficient about its wishes to live our lives in accordance with those wishes. But I think the question of meaning in life is important, not whether it's got anything to do with God, because I think that's not relevant. But the question of meaning in life is important because I think, as I said in response to the question about death, that this is, I believe, our only chance. I don't think there is another go. It's not a rehearsal. It's not a brief episode in an eternal existence. We're not going to go on anywhere else and get a second chance. And so I think that given that we have this opportunity, we should make the most of it. And I do think that together with many of the philosophers that have been spoken about this evening, I do think that our best chance of living well is to be self-reflective and to think about these questions, to think about what the best way to live is, to think about why we should do this rather than that, to think about what will give us fulfillment, to think about what we can do for other people to help them achieve the fullest happiness that they can in their one life. And so I think if we think about this question, if we ask ourselves this question, if we listen to what other people have got to say about this question, we'll learn to live better lives ourselves. And I think that life lies there in front of us for our own responsible undertaking It's not got a single meaning that we can conveniently have gifted to us from one book. It's a complicated and messy enterprise. And so I think we need to think carefully about how we're going to confront it. And this question is one of the ways of looking at that. And so I think it's valuable to discuss it. That's why it matters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Briefly, Andy?
Yeah, exactly. So I think, do you know, I forget who it was who said, I think, no, it's gone, but the quotation, something's always struck me. So that, you know, the greatest challenge in a person's life comes not when they're weary of suffering, but when they're weary of pleasure. I think it's interesting. We live in an age where I think that's very much the reality for many of us. You know, we have more possessions, we have more stuff, we have more education, more politics, more science, more of so many things. Yet it's interesting that the meaning question is being asked more frequently. I find you can fill rooms like this with this topic more than for any other. It's popping up everywhere because I think there is this deep recognition that actually we need more than just our material needs met. Viktor Frankl, who I began with, raised that question. So I think this whole question of meaning is hugely, hugely important because otherwise we are going to live hollow lives and end up profoundly unhappy, as David Foster Wallace, that novelist I shared with you, observed. But the last thing I want to say is this: the whole question of meaning as well is uncomfortable for some of us. I think sometimes we try and avoid it because it raises the possibility, what if I'm not living the right kind of life? What if there's, you know, I'm not aligning with the way life is supposed to be? You know, it's interesting, for all of our sophistication, we are only a couple of steps from anarchy. Steven Pinker, who is a writer I know that Andrew admires. It's interesting. He's Canadian background, and he wrote an essay a few years ago commenting on what happened when the police in Montreal went on strike a few years ago. And he said they went on strike at 9 a.m. By 11:20, the first bank was robbed. By noon, most downtown stores had closed because of looting. By the end of the day, 6 banks had been robbed, 100 shops looted, 12 fires set, and $3 million in property damage before city authorities had to call in the army and, of course, the Mounties. This decisive empirical test left my politics and my philosophy in tatters. And I think the question of meaning gets to a much deeper question that we haven't really touched tonight, but I encourage you as you head out into the evening to think about, what if my life does not align with the way it's supposed to be? What if there is such a thing as a good life, a life well lived, and I fall short of that? Most religions and most philosophies will tell you, work harder, do good to more people, you know, do some good humanist kind of causes. If you're in the Islamic faith, you know, work harder, keep more of the commandments, try. And the problem is it's performance-based, and we end up burning ourselves out and still feeling that we've missed something. The profound answer that I think the Christian faith for me has to this question is that it's not about performance, it's not about me, it's about what God has done for me in Jesus Christ, which gives us the only basis for meaning and significance and purpose that is not based on our own performance and therefore doesn't repeat the whole cycle of striving and failing and falling short that lies behind so much of the difficulty at the heart of the human condition. It's been a great question to discuss. It's been a privilege discussing it with you, Andrew, this evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next slide. What a tremendous evening we've had. So before I draw tonight's event to a close, I would like to say a few thank yous and also talk about how to keep in touch. So the biggest thanks, of course, goes to our two distinguished speakers. It's not easy to kind of answer things on the spot, and I think they have done a tremendous job. Really thank you and really appreciate all your efforts tonight. You've approached tonight's questions, obviously from very different perspectives, but you've both helped us to unpack it in such an engaging, passionate and accessible way that has given us much food for thought. But I think the one thing that I was particularly struck by was the very gracious and courteous tone with which you've conducted the discussion. So thank you so much for that. I would also like to thank Tony Courts and Tim Mitchell, who have been in charge of the AV facilities tonight. They've done a great job there. I'd like to thank Tim Pryor for acting as our moderator for the Q&A, tucked over in the corner there. Tim, do you want to stand up so we can so they acknowledge you? No? It's okay. Well, okay. He's tucked in the corner there, and so thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank our fantastic team of stewards who have been on their feet all evening, helping us out. Thank you so much for that. And last but not least, of course, thank you for coming and for supporting the event in such great numbers and making it such a special occasion. So, the slide is up here now. So if you've enjoyed tonight's event and you would like to be informed of future events of a similar nature, please do leave your contact details with us. There are several ways you can do this. So if you registered on Eventbrite, you can just respond to the follow-up email that we will be sending to you. Secondly, you can send your name and email address to the same mobile number and email address that is on the screen behind me. Or thirdly, you can do it in the traditional way. Just pop your name and email address in the ballot box, which is by the Waterstones table. If you'd like to speak to the speakers, they'll be available afterwards in front of the stage. Don't forget to visit the Waterstones table and also the tables by Husa and Rooted in Christ. And the cafe will be open till 10 o'clock, so please do stay back. And so last of all, just to say thank you again and good night.